coming. I've just gotten a phone call that we have 2 commissioners who are looking for parking spaces. In case anyone thinks that parking is an issue in Palo Alto that the Planning Commission should experience. So when they arrive, we'll get started. The speaker cards are on the table, and you just fill them out and then hand them up here, and we'll make sure you get a chance to speak on whatever topic you're interested in. Tonight's meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission to order. So thank you all for coming. Let's begin with roll call. Secretary Elner, will you please call the roll?
Commissioner Alchek, Commissioner Gardias,
Present.
Vice Chair Keller,
Present.
Commissioner King,
Present.
Chair Michael,
Present.
Commissioner Rosenblum,
Present.
Commissioner Tanaka. At this moment, there's 6 present, and I believe you said you saw Commissioner Alchek.
I understand Commissioner Alchek sent me, he sent me a text saying he was running a few minutes late.
Okay, thank you.
So before we get to oral communications, let's outline the agenda, which consists of 2 items. The first is a study session under the topic of the priorities of the Planning and Transportation Commission. And the second is a public hearing on the comprehensive plan update, specifically discussion of alternative futures and issues for consideration in the environmental impact report, the EIR scoping of the comp plan update. It's our intention to take up the second topic on the comprehensive plan at approximately 6 o'clock. And so we will spend the first part of the meeting on the study session, the priorities of the PTC, probably take a short intermission, and then reconvene at 6 on the comp plan. So with that, we begin our meeting with oral communications, which is a time when members of the public may speak to any item not on the agenda. 3 minutes per speaker. Do we have any cards for oral communications?
This one for oral communications? Kevin Murray?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And is Shani Kleinhaus, that's also for oral communications? And these are for oral communications? These ones, Nielsen and Buchanan and Michael Griffith? So we have 4 speakers.
Okay. Please proceed.
The first speaker is Kevin Murray, and 3 minutes?
Sure.
You'll have about 3 minutes.
3 minutes, thank you. Good evening. Thank you, gentlemen and ladies, for volunteering your time. I know it's a lot of effort and energy. My name is Kevin Murray, 2091 Harvard Street, 1960 Palo Alto, long-term native. In the 55 years that I've lived in this town, there's been tremendous changes. The last 15 in particular have been horrific. I want to make it clear that the direction of this town should be strictly for no more development, no more dense housing, no more apartments, no more condos. I could recite to you well over 35 buildings that have been knocked down and expanded to 3 to 4 stories. The town that I was raised in, beginning again in 1960, has changed dramatically. But worse, the changes in the last 15 years have been incredible. I'm not judging you. Obviously, previous city councils in collusion with developers have created the current Palo Alto. My passion is to ensure that we leave right where we are and we do not expand any further. This does not preclude the private ownership concept that those who own commercial properties certainly have the right to demolish those buildings and replace them with new environmentally efficient buildings, but they cannot expand upon the square footage that they currently enjoy. I want to emphasize that correctly. I'm very happy that I've seen in recent correspondence a plethora of fellow Palo Altans who are finally changing the political winds in my city, in my town, well, it used to be my town, such that we're going to run a slate of candidates to stop this nonsense. Shut it down. We're done. We're at capacity. We're maxed out. I don't even recognize my own hometown anymore. The success of Silicon Valley can be pushed to other communities throughout this nation, and certainly in the East Bay, East Palo Alto, the list goes on of underdeveloped areas. We'll always be successful. We've got Stanford U in our background. There's a previous research there, been affiliated with it since the 60s when my dad did his doctoral work there. We've always got SU as our R&D focus, and that will always be a focus here in the community of Palo Alto. But I want to emphasize, I've looked at your 4 plans. I like the 3rd, which says slow growth, but to me that's a euphemism that still allows growth. Don't want it. I'll do everything I can to put together that slate of candidates and flip it, stop it. We'll be financially just fine. It is obscene, the 4 homes that I own in Palo Alto, what they're worth, but it's incredibly important to have quality of life over quantity of life. And I'm that generation now that's going to help make that change, because clearly the previous 2 or 3 councils have not. They've set us up and instead what we're facing. I thank you again for your time. I look forward to hearing your deliberations, your recommendations, but I can assure you that this is the perspective not just of me, but of a growing course of the wind change, the political wind change here in the town of Palo Alto. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Shani Kleinhaus on oral communications, not on a topic on the agenda.
Thank you, Chair Michael and commissioners. My name is Shani Kleinhaus. I'm here to speak on behalf of Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. I'm the environmental advocate for that organization. And last week, or maybe the week before, I spoke to the Architectural Review Board on bird-safe design of buildings and about the relationship between glass and bird collisions. The estimate for bird death due to collisions with glass buildings in the United States is somewhere between 300 million and 1 billion birds a year. I would think Palo Alto has quite a lot of that in residential and in industrial areas. And so I want to bring that to your attention. I think one of the pictures we have in this brochure here is the Mitchell Park Library. This would be a model of how not to build a building if you want to protect birds from colliding into it. And I hope we can monitor that building and see what happens during migration season in the spring when young birds are just finding their way around. If you're interested in seeing the presentation, the same one that I gave to the Architectural Review Board, happy to bring it here as well. And I hope you pay attention to this as projects come in front of you. Thank you.
He's representing the group.
No, he's not representing the group now.
No.
Are you representing the group are you talking to the agenda item, or are you talking, Nielsen?
Yes.
Are you talking the agenda item?
Agenda item.
Should that occur after 6 o'clock, or?
Yeah, on the comp plan?
Yeah, so I'll just put this as agenda item 2. And it's the same thing with Michael Griffin, agenda item 2? Great, thank you.
Okay, so that concludes oral communications. Do we have a brief director's report from Director Gittleman?
Yes, thank you. Just a few things I wanted the commission to be updated on. You probably are aware of this already, but our direction from the council was to proceed with submitting a draft of the housing element to HCD for their initial comments, knowing that we'll get comments back and we'll have to do some revisions, and the document will come to the commission again, also to the community panel, the Regional Housing Mandate Committee, and the City Council before it's finalized. But the document that's going out to HCD will go out this week. We decided if we sent it before the July 4th holiday, they probably weren't going to look at it anyway. So it's going to go out this week. We also the other items I was going to report on relate to the comp plan, just on past events, the last workshop we held, and the upcoming meeting at the City Council. So maybe and the leadership group appointment, but I'll wait until the comp plan item at 6 o'clock for those items.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's proceed to the topic on the Planning and Transportation Commission priorities. And as background for people in the public and members of the commission who may not have participated in a session that we had earlier this year on our commission processes, priorities, and overall effectiveness. One of the things that we were intending to do with that offsite was to develop a better understanding for ourselves of what our objectives were for the year, so that we could plan the work, work with staff, engage with the public, and look back at the end of the period and note that we had accomplished the things that were the most important or not. We also talked at the offsite about how the commission operated. Obviously, it's often through conducting public hearings like this evening. In addition, there's a pre-commission meeting before every regular meeting, which goes over what will be sort of the agenda and the process for the meeting. And occasionally we designate subcommittees or appoint representatives to serve as a liaison to different bodies that deal with planning and transportation issues. But one of just as the context, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the fact that the Planning and Transportation Commission is an advisory body appointed by council. We don't necessarily have final authority to determine actions. That power is held by council. And so in terms of the effectiveness of the commission, there are a number of points that I wanted to note before we get into a discussion. An effective commission would be one that delivers recommendations to council which are useful, which are valuable and insightful. An effective commission is one that holds public meetings which are successful in engaging with the public, where the public can make input, ask questions, comments, and be informed about the issues. An effective commission is one that operates at a high level of quality in our deliberations and in the conduct of our hearings. We're collegial, thoughtful, but provocative, perhaps. We also have a relationship with other bodies within the city government, other than council, such as the ARB. We frequently have joint meetings with the ARB. We have some overlapping or sort of collaborative responsibilities. For example, PC zoning applications, which are currently on hold, will require action by both bodies. The interaction we have with staff is very important. We frequently have an agenda which is informed by having staff reports and staff recommendations, and we often work with staff if we have questions regarding the topics that we are to consider. And at times, it's useful for us to operate with subcommittees. There's a principle of transparency, open government, Palo Alto. The Brown Act applies if there's a quorum of the body which is meeting or discussing or doing anything. But if we have a subcommittee of less than a quorum of the council, sometimes preliminary work can be done, which can then be brought to the full council for normal public hearing. And finally, I want to note that you'd think that the Planning Commission would engage at times in thought leadership regarding planning, and hopefully this comes out as part of our normal work and interactions, but sometimes we'll do some research or thinking and may occasionally generate something called a colleagues memo. That's fairly rare, but when it happens, it can be useful. So with that, I just wanted to open up to my colleagues on the commission for thoughts about the priorities for the second half of the year. We had in our packet the listing of the tentative agenda items, which I believe is on the table, or it's available to the public. And there's...
Would it be possible to move the chairs so the visual and sound barrier? It's a soft-spoken chairman.
Here I am.
Deaf me.
And I will try to be more outspoken. But the tentative agenda items that are listed for the next 6 months, it's a relatively short list. One of the things we'd like to do is make sure this is the right list and what items we would expect to naturally sort of be put on the list as we move later in the year. And just to summarize for anybody who hasn't studied this list, one thing is action on the comprehensive plan update, particularly the EIR scoping. Planned community zoning reform will occur through 2 sessions, one study session and one later discussion of making a recommendation to council. Modifications to the Build 2 line requirements, topic relating to shuttle services, action on the current update of the housing element, action on a piece of the residential permit parking program, and then there's some items that that we might think that are missing from this list that we'd like to add, and maybe I'll just not comment on those at the moment and just open it up to colleagues to touch on any issue that you think bears on the work that we should be doing over the next 6 months, and or how we should be doing the work so that we do a good job and fulfill our obligation to the public and to the council. So would anyone like to brainstorm on this topic? Commissioner Rosenblum? And take roughly 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
I think I'll take less. Thanks for kicking this off. I think it's really useful. I think it was a recent council session where one of our council members, and I think it was Schmidt, had said it's really just we only have one issue, which is determine what level of density we want. And I think that for the Planning Commission, things that are around density and transit are obviously key. The thing that's missing from the agenda, as far as I can tell, is the counterpart to a parking permit program, which would be TDM, so a more comprehensive program. I think that in restricting it to just a permit program, I think we're talking about just half of a problem, which causes other problems. And so I want to see the other half of the problem on the agenda. In terms of other issues around how dense we're going to be, I would assume that that rolls into the discussions of the housing element update recommendation, and also additional hearings on the comprehensive plan, although that's not specifically on the agenda. And so want to make sure that the agenda reflects a number of steps on the comprehensive plan to move forward. So I know that today we're reviewing some of the inputs to the model on choices 1 through 4. I would assume that the next step is to say, here's output from the model, here's what happens in case 1, 2, 3, and 4, and here are the environmental impacts, here are the other impacts that we can see, but that has to be explicitly on the agenda. So in terms of my priorities, if they're around density and transit, additional TDM discussion, or at least a comprehensive parking and transit management solution, and then a system of seeing where we're going from today's discussion of alternatives with environmental impact to eventual recommendations and adoption.
Thank you very much. I think that's good input. Who would like to go next? I see Vice Chair Keller is making notes.
Sure. So one thing is I'm going to call my attention to somebody in the audience, namely Stephen Levy, who is with the Center for the Study of the Continuing Study of the California Economy. Is that the correct title? Okay. And so one of the things is that I think there's an opportunity to do an evaluation of the broad trends going on in our city. And there's a number of different trends, such as, for example, the city is aging. The city is now more than half single person families, single person households, and 2-person households. There's also, when we build new housing that's multi-bedroom, it tends to be filled with parents with children. And so there's also the increasing densification of, in terms of the squeezing people into offices with smaller and smaller amount of square footage per person. So I think that it might be interesting, with Stephen's help, to try to figure out what these trends are, and to try to understand the trend lines and how they affect the city, how they affect traffic. Also, there's increasing use of transit, and especially increasing use of walking and especially biking to work. So understanding what we can do about these trends, understanding how we can push the levers so that the extent to which we cause more people to walk to work or bike to work or take public transit means that there's less pressure on parking and less pressure on traffic, and therefore the amount of that we can grow might be based on parking and traffic. So I think that it'd be interesting to actually look at this from not from a sort of planning model as I see it, which is kind of I think of myself as a scientist. I like to see formulas. I like to see models that are actually have mathematical systems to them. And I think that with these trends, we might be able to come up with a mathematical system for Palo Alto and then be able to adjust it. And I'm sure that Stephen Levy's work is full of mathematical formulae and whatever that I don't even understand. But I think that might be an interesting thing to think about doing in a study session, to try to identify what these trends are and then try to quantify them and try to use those trends in our modeling. To some extent, we're doing that imperfectly with the traffic model. There is data coming in terms of a new traffic model for the city of Palo Alto. I think that once the traffic model is complete, it'd be nice to get the results of that traffic model and understand whether that comes by. So I'd like to see that come back to us soon. I think that we've agreed that we're going to have a transportation item on the agenda at least every quarter. So we have shuttle services as a transportation item. I think that in terms of the fall TMA, which is something that's in the process, and TDM, as mentioned by Commissioner Rosenblum, is an excellent transportation item that should come back before us. And I also think that we should think in terms of the kinds of growth that if we had, to the extent we have housing growth, and we have to have it because Pleasanton said no more housing growth and they got shot down for that. But we can think about the kind of housing growth that we have and the amount of housing growth we have. The amount of market rate housing, maybe we only need the amount that RENA allocates to us. Maybe we have a suggestion of the kind of housing that we need. For example, about 3% of the housing in Palo Alto, total number of housing units, is studio apartments. And about 17% of the housing in Palo Alto currently is one-bedroom apartments. So we need more housing for seniors because the seniors are living in our community. They may want to downsize and stay in our community, but there's no place for them to go. And we think about young people moving out to our community don't have a place to be either. So that's the kind of housing, when we think of it in terms of a range of housing options. It's not a range of new housing options, it's really a range of housing options based on what we already have, and what is underrepresented is these smaller units. And so I think we should focus on, which, by the way, happens to have the benefit of a less of an impact on our schools, a direct impact. Obviously, seniors moving out of their housing into senior housing means that families can move in, but it's more of an organic process than the double whammy you get when you add new housing that's for families. Thank you.
Commissioner King?
Thank you. And do I need a microphone?
Yeah.
How are we doing this? Grab this one. Thank you. Let's see. I'll spend my 3 minutes or so on process. I think I've mentioned this before, but I don't believe we've made any strides as far as the process in support of making it easier for the public to engage with what we're doing, particularly when it comes to meetings. And so we obviously by Brown Act, we have to put out the agenda 3 days in advance, but what we get is the presentations, often PowerPoint presentations from applicants, staff, at the meeting. And so it seems that there should be some way that technologically feasible that we can, and then I believe that now those things never get posted to the agenda website, so that those things are basically gone forever. So the public cannot go back and access what the applicants, correct me if you think I'm wrong. And so my vision would be that any proposed or graphics presentations that are going to come before our commission would have some time limit, whether it's however long technically makes it possible to then upload that to the website, whether that's 12 noon, the day before, 3 days before, so that the public, if they're at home watching the commission meetings, they can easily access it just as they can with the current staff reports. And that would be uploaded so that if somebody wants to go back to past meeting agendas, they would have all the information that was presented at the time. And part of that now, of course, with the broadcast, you can see the presentations, but the resolution is so low that you often can't, if there are any figures, it's very hard to read any fine print, anything other than really saying graphs or maybe photos. So that would be one of my goals, to figure out how, and I don't know whether that's your department, Hillary, or whether that's the communications people, but I'd like to investigate how we could do that and why. And I'm also not sure how long it takes for the so there's the live stream, and then they actually will store on our media center, they will store the actual meeting. And so if somebody wants to come back later, I'm not sure how long the lag time is yet on that, but ideally that would not be a long period of time. Okay, and then the other process thing is more selfish for me as a commissioner, and I think for the other commissioners. We've had, I think the last meeting we had that huge stack, probably 200 pages on one project. And I see that there's been some improvements. I see now with our pack tonight, there is some things are labeled, at the top of the first page of the attachments. But it makes it, especially given two-sided, it makes it very challenging if you're going to go through the stuff initially and mark it up. But then when we're in the meeting, when someone, staff or a commission or a public, refers to something within the reports on these big ones, it really makes it cumbersome to go back and forth and find the same page. I think we had last meeting we had an issue where we were all trying to find something and there was no pagination. So I suspect there's some technology, maybe the copier technology, where the whole packet related to a specific agenda item would be paginated so that we can all say, oh, it's on page such and such. So that would be my goal, and same with any PowerPoint presentations, things were delivered at the meeting at places, that those would be required to be paginated so that we can easily access and discuss them. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Tanaka?
Yeah, so thanks for kicking us off. I think it's actually important for us to talk about this once in a while, because I think often we don't. So I guess just turn out to a really high level. I think about, what does the PTC do uniquely well versus what the City Council does and versus what other boards and commission does. And with that in mind, I've been thinking about, for us, we're focused on planning and transportation. Although we're all very busy, I think we actually have more time than City Council. And I think it's actually important for us to discuss and have a very healthy debate about these kind of higher level issues about density, about transportation, about parking. And while I see the agenda has, a really, I think one that's pretty high level is the PC reform, but a lot of these other ones are fairly low level, relatively. And I think, we're not a decision-making body, so we're going to make recommendations, but I think kind of an input to making a recommendation is actually to have a lot of community input, and I'm actually glad to see that there's quite a bit of the community here today. But I think we need to strive to do more than that. I mean, to do as much as we can, because I think, by the time it hits the City Council level, I think the amount of discussion that can be had, the amount of debate, is probably more limited than what it is at our level. So I would encourage perhaps more study session, more outreach. And I've always been a big fan of trying to enable more modern ways of communications, but I know there's a lot of Brown Act issues preventing that. But I think thinking of ways to get more community involvement and get more input, because we're talking about some major questions. And I think the other issue is that unfortunately, there's not one right answer, and it really depends on the goals. And the goals for the city, I think it really depends on who you're talking to, right? The goals for perhaps some people may be to have zero growth. Some other people maybe want to have a very vibrant economy, and so it's something which, unfortunately, is not going to be one right answer. But I think it's definitely good for everyone to hear the debate and for this to be known, so that when decisions are made, people feel like they have their input and viewpoints are considered. Yeah, so I think if I think about our work product, it is the recommendations that we make to City Council, and of course these are recommendations. These are not going to be something that City Council is necessarily going to rubber stamp. But I think what's really important for us as a body is to really be able to synthesize the salient points, so that on the City Council level, they can really think about it and see whether the proper viewpoints are considered. And I think I'm looking back on other previous projects. I think most of the time we do that, but I'm not sure we do it as well as we could. And there's one other constituent which I think wasn't mentioned, which I do believe is also important, is there are developers who are putting their time and money in trying to invest in this community. And I think also having a timely process for that as well is also important, because while we're in a fortunate situation where there's a lot of people who want to invest in Palo Alto, I think it's, we owe it to the residents, we owe it to the business here. I think we also owe it to people who are trying to invest in here, because I think we do want to be a very vibrant city, and that means investment, whether it means just renovating a place or whether it means building something new. So I think being somewhat transparent on that as well makes sense. I'll just touch base on just a couple of points that some of my fellow commissioners have made as well. So I do agree with Vice Chair Keller in regards to smaller units. I think that's something that's in dire need. And so if we were mandated to have housing growth, having them in form of smaller units for the younger workers as well as the seniors in the city makes a lot of sense. So that's my feedback on the priorities.
So either Commissioner Alchek or Commissioner Gardias? Commissioner Alchek?
Good evening. I think I'll start with process. I think it might be a good suggestion. I thought about this a lot in the last couple of meetings. This notion of expanding on what's involved in the staff's recommendation. I say that because we often spend a great deal of time on this commission, debating components of the projects we review. And then I think overwhelmingly we ultimately approve a staff recommendation at the conclusion of our meetings. And I wonder if we would benefit from understanding what's involved in the staff recommendation. I think to some extent there's a community of participants that think that the developer brings the project in and the staff goes, great, stamps it with an approval, and then it comes to us unaltered from potentially its original manifestation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my impression that over the course of weeks and months, staff makes a lot of suggestions to project applicants about their projects to get them to conform in a suitable way to our requirements, so that when it gets to us, there's this acceptable, at least in the staff's opinion, project. And I wonder if sometimes we would benefit from maybe a greater discussion of what went on during those meetings to arrive at the staff recommendation, so that when we discuss the project, for example, unit mix, unit size, specifically thinking about our last meeting, placement of the driveway, all these elements that were involved in our last project, maybe the changes that maybe the project as we see it has been changed so dramatically from an original idea that we would appreciate more what staff is actually recommending. Because if at the end of the day a lot of the debate that we have is something that was a part of a discussion earlier that was potentially off the record because the project arrived to us in a different condition, I think we would benefit from it, I think, from a process perspective. Look, we had one speaker today talk about the changing winds. I think it's sort of tough at this point to identify priorities for the Planning Commission in an environment where everything is up in the air. I think there's maybe a little disconnect for me, understanding at what point the Planning Commission will be more involved with our Palo Alto process. Like, if we are the scribes if we are the assistant scribes of the comprehensive plan that is in its formation phase, then when do we get involved in a more sincere way with our Palo Alto process? At what point do we begin to get a chance to digest some of those discussions. Because as we all know, at some point we are assigned to subcommittees on each of the elements, and we begin the process of reviewing the draft of the next comprehensive plan. And I would be delighted if we could be a part of that. Considering my term is through 2017, I'd like to think that we would be starting that process before that term ends, considering when the comprehensive plan is supposed to begin its application. So I'd like to think that the priorities are currently being set by the community in a community-based approach. And so, you know, I think Eric's point about the TDM as a component of the parking, look, it's like the parking permits. That was a priority that was brought to us by the community. I think if we can add to it in terms of focusing the discussion in addition to just permitting to TDM, I think that's actually an excellent point. Adding to this, adding priorities other than, I think, making our process as efficient as possible is hard for me, because I'm so involved, I'm so eager to see how the our Palo Alto effort decides or directs us in terms of what the priorities for the city's growth should be. I guess our biggest priority should be understanding the conclusions of the Palo Alto process over the next year, so that we can really synthesize those conclusions into the formation of the comprehensive plan.
Commissioner Gardias.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, a couple of comments, right? So, from perspective of the engagement with the community, I mean, your presence here is always welcome for us. It's very refreshing. Every comment that you bring here, it's pretty much as, you know, value added from any side. So please come more often. Bring us your comments and questions. We appreciate this very much, and you know, we want to just make sure that whatever we decide here is truly representative to your opinion and views. So, from perspective of engaging the community more, I thought that, and Commissioner King mentioned about this, right, about some visual presentations. Because we are the Planning and Transportation Committee, it would be nice to have a comprehensive plan behind us or somewhere on the wall, you know, in addition to some other visuals. You know, many people are visual. So just if we discuss certain subjects, somebody can just stand up and just point at some lot and just bring it to the reference, right? So if this could be arranged, that would be great. Maybe bigger map on the wall. And also, when presentations are prepared, they are, of course, on certain subjects, developments, or some other study. It would be very useful just to have those presentations prepare focused on from the perspective of the inhabitants, recipients. Like when we discussed the page mill development, we didn't have anybody in the audience speaking to the project, which just put us in the understanding that everything worked well. But you know, regardless of this presentation slides, that would have the reference of the development to the neighboring houses on the second page, that would probably steer more interest from the community as well. So those two comments about the engagement of the community from the perspective of some other preferences that I may have, and I spoke to them at some other meetings, right? So housing element, I propose that we should have some sort of methodology. Because from past meetings, it would be good to understand what's the balance and cost of the housing element. We know that that housing element may be very costly, and we had some developments that had initially that housing element, but they were stripped of it later on And I'm talking about this development on a lot of the former Shell station that had, if you remember, the housing elements on top, and then later on it changed because it was so excessive and became office itself. So, but bottom line is pretty much just to have a comprehensive housing element methodology that would allow us and the public to understand what's the cost and benefit comprehensively, right? Because it could cost us a lot, because we could give up lots of floor area ratio or other measurements to the developers for not much. The second thing is that we talk about at some other meeting about the parking policy, but what I was proposing is just to approach it from the mobility perspective. That would be a common denominator of all the transportation studies. I would like to see this to be focused from not from the perspective of the parking mandate or some other meters, but from the perspective how mobile is our Palo Altans. And then based on this, we can just have some directions toward the development itself. There is another thing that we talk about at some other meeting, but I just want to name it for the purpose of this meeting, from the perspective of TDM that other commissioners mentioned, but also for the in regards to the mobility, some comprehensive study of all the transportation carriers, including VTA, city transportation, Stanford transportation, how all these agencies may work together for benefit of Palo Altans being mobile, and also just having others that come to Palo Alto to work, come or shop, come very easily and very quickly. There is another item that we talked that I talked to Cara during the orientation process, but I haven't shared with my colleagues, is that to embed in our thinking or in the policies some element of the opportunity for the local businesses, for the local developers, or for the local merchants that were born in Palo Alto and want to grow up with the city. Those historically merchants were building their offices, were building their stores, they were building their townhouses when in the ground floor there was a store. And then if we think that we can have smaller lots that would allow smaller developers or local developers or merchants compete for those smaller lots, build on these lots, maintain those lots, it would mean probably for the community a lot, right? Because you have a structure growing with the man, and that could be a local person pretty much, right? As opposed to having large developer that could just swipe it easily, everything off. And smaller parties would not be able to compete. There is also some other elements that I would like to mention for the benefit of this meeting. When we talk about different zoning, that is of course important for the planning community, for the planning and transportation community and our thinking. But then some of our residents may not comprehend how those plans work. So there is something, and then also in regards to some concerns that I heard of about how to constrain variety of different buildings types, and then somebody talked about glazing here. Somebody invented form-based planning, where community is designed not based on the two-dimensional plan, but based on the three-dimensional plan that governs development of this community. So that's another point that I would like to propose. Thank you very much. Sorry for the long time that I took.
No, that's perfect. So sometimes when we have the round table speaking last, everything has been covered, but I've got a few items that I wanted to mention. On process, Just to note that we really have, as a commission, a strong commitment to continuous improvement of how we operate. And hopefully that is measurable in some way with the results that we produce. I think one pattern or expectation that has developed over the last few years is oftentimes planning topics come before the PTC, and then they go next to council, and council engages in a de novo review. They basically start over and don't have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of what work goes on earlier. And I think that this is has two negative effects. One is I think that the public is conditioned to go directly to council if you have any input, because that's where the decision is made and they start over from scratch. So why bother at the planning commission stage? And I think that seriously diminishes the effectiveness of council. And also it deprives the public of the opportunity to have two bites at the apple. And I think that in order to maybe evolve beyond council automatically defaulting to a de novo review, we should figure out some way in our process that we formalize our message to council on matters that we first consider and then they take up next, such that perhaps some of them, at least where it's appropriate, would be acted on the consent calendar at council, that they could reserve their time for working on the things that are the greatest concern to the public. Another process issue, and I've requested some advice from the city attorney, occurred to me when recently we took up the downtown development cap, and we had very few speakers from the public when the downtown development cap topic came to the PTC, only 3 speakers. But then the article that Gennady wrote in the Weekly and Palo Online generated a torrent of responses, and there were, I think I counted a minimum of 30 responses, many of which were anonymous, which I think is regrettable. But the thinking and the opinions and the controversy in the online forum was 10 to 1 more engaged than our meeting. And so one of the questions was, could we, and I think this goes to Commissioner King, develop a way that we could have a virtual study session? Because there are a lot of people would like to have input, raise questions, but they can't, for whatever reason, attend the meeting. And maybe they feel more comfortable contributing online, but
You can't find parking.
yeah, that was probably my head tonight. But anyway, the idea would be, where appropriate, we might sort of post all the materials in advance for a topic, engage with the public in some way that the city attorney advises us is compliant with the Brown Act, such that these outpouring of incredibly thoughtful or energetic opinions from the city residents could factor into our discussion and recommendations to council. So maybe we can do that. I think it would be helpful in improving trust with the public if the PTC set an example in terms of taking another look at our ex parte communications policy. When there's a matter and an applicant wants to have contact, it was a quasi-judicial matter, and an applicant wants to have private meetings with members of the commission, the same thing goes on at council. We're required to disclose that such meetings occurred and what was discussed. And usually the disclosure, both here and at council, is there was a meeting, nothing was learned other than what was in the public record. And frankly, as a resident, that doesn't do it for me, because for some reason, applicants seriously think that having these meetings helps them. And I think that just the pattern of meeting with virtually everybody on the body suggests that they think it creates some bias in their favor. And I think that our policy about how we disclose ex parte communications, if they occur, should be more, there should be more disclosure, so that if there's bias, that would be more evident. I would like maybe some adjustment in how we use our time at meetings, such that we have more time for the public to talk to us rather than for us to talk. And that's hard when we have very few people from the public in attendance, but like tonight. And just briefly on some of the possible topics for the Second half of the year, I think we're going to be taking a look at the downtown development cap, which is a policy. It's not clear to me how enforceable this policy is in terms of an actual cap. But there's a lot of interest that some people have expressed in whether Palo Alto should have a specific plan or a precise plan for the downtown area. And I think that when we take a look at the downtown development cap, we should also take a look at whether in the comp plan update, there should be a reference to a commitment to do a specific plan or a precise plan for the downtown area whenever that would be feasible. Clearly, that's a big effort. And then I believe credit Arthur, Vice Chair Keller, with the idea that we should review kind of the operation of the density bonus ordinance, where we've had a grand total of 1 application, and it appears that there's some value in being clear as to what data is relevant to our consideration and recommendations on that. Other thoughts that I may have would probably come up in the context of the comp plan update topic, which we'll take up after a short intermission. So we'll be back in 10 minutes, reconvene at 6:10. Thank you very much. The next topic is the comprehensive plan update, a discussion of alternative futures and issues for consideration in the environmental impact report, the AR scoping. And we'll begin with a report from staff. Director Gittleman.
Thank you, Chair Michael and Commissioners. I'm Hillary Gittleman, the Planning Director, and I wanted to start with just a few remarks before turning this over to Stephen Turner, who's managing this process with his staff and our consultants. In our earlier discussion, it was brought up, what's the Planning Commission's role in the comprehensive plan update? And I wanted to emphasize that it couldn't be more important. You all contributed, those of you who are on the Commission, contributed to a draft policy document that the City Council has received and that will be valuable input to this process. And even more importantly, this evening, you're really taking a first step in looking at the input we've received so far on general concepts and alternatives, and teeing that up for a City Council discussion of alternative futures in early August. We think this is absolutely critical, and it's going to lead to a very, we hope, fruitful and productive analysis after we decide on the general concepts that are to be analyzed. We know that after the City Council discussion on August 3rd, we owe you a better description of what your role will be in later phases of the comprehensive plan process. I want you to be aware that we are, thinking about that. A lot of this depends on the Council's discussion on August 4th and what they choose to do as next steps. But we will get back to you after that discussion with more specifics about your role and how we'll be able to leverage all the work that you've done to date and your discussions this evening to take this planning process to a successful conclusion. As you know, our goal is to get to the finish line by the end of 2015 on a comprehensive update to the city's comprehensive plan. You can also help us between now and August 4th spread the word about alternatives. And I see that the commissioners have some index cards there with website information on it. We're really trying to get the word out. Thank you. And asking you to distribute those cards to 25 of your closest friends because the input doesn't stop this evening or on August 4th. We really want members of the public who can't come to meetings to go on our website, provide the kind of input that they would be able to provide if they were here, any other ideas that occur to them about critical issues that are facing the city of Palo Alto, what some alternative futures might look like that we should analyze in this process, hoping that by the end of the process we get to forming a collective vision for the future of our city that is every bit as useful and important as the last comp plan was to the future generations and that we're trying to leverage or build on. Anyway, that's all I had to say, except with one addition, which is, I think I referenced it earlier, that I wanted the commission to know that the city manager did appoint what's called a leadership group, 13 individuals from our community that we're asking to help us with community outreach and engagement during the comprehensive plan update. The group hasn't even met yet, but we hope that we'll convene them this month and that they will help the staff and by extension the commission get the word out on all of these issues and ensure that by the end of the day we have a full suite of input from all directions on this planning process, and everybody's idea is taken into consideration as we start to winnow down and get to a revised plan. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen and his consultants for a brief presentation, and then we'll get on to the main event, which is the public testimony and the Commission's feedback on the materials in your packet today.
Great. Thank you, Hillary. I'm Stephen Turner, the Advanced Planning Manager. I'm very pleased to bring this back to the Commission for your review and comment. The last time that we met with the Commission was back at the end of April, on April 30th. And at that time, staff presented you with a status update on our work on the comprehensive plan update. And we also described the Palo Alto concept that the City Council had adopted as a framework for organizing all of the concurrent planning efforts that staff has been working on over these past few months. And we also outlined a schedule for completion of the comprehensive plan amendment by December of 2015. Well, we have a lot of good news to report since our last meeting. Number one, Council reviewed the Planning Commission's work of goals, policies, and programs that were contained in our comprehensive plan policy document, version 1.0. Council provided a lot of comment and feedback, and that feedback is contained within an attachment in your staff report, so you can see what they said about those policies and programs. Number two, Council also accepted our plan for community engagement. Staff has been working extremely hard over the past 2 or 3 months to really implement that plan, and we have a lot of information to present to you tonight with that regard. Council also accepted the California Avenue concept plan as part of the comprehensive plan update, and so that will be moving forward with the comprehensive plan. As Hillary mentioned, we have developed the leadership group that will advise us on engagement matters, and that will start up very shortly. And I think probably the best news is that we're still on schedule, which is no small feat given all of the time that has taken so far. So really, where are we now? As I mentioned before, we have draft goals, policies, and programs contained within our policy document. We've released a notice of preparation at the end of May, which really signals our intent to prepare a program EIR for the comprehensive plan, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well tonight. We're in the middle of really the period of soliciting public input and comment within the program EIR, and tonight's meeting is a very important step in obtaining that public input. We have designed 2 opportunities in addition to the community engagement meetings that we will talk about to solicit that input tonight, and then also with the City Council on August 4th. So those are 2 opportunities for people to provide comments and questions that will help guide our environmental review going forward. So for tonight, we really have 2 main goals. We want to accept the public testimony on environmental issues and the alternatives as proposed, and then have the Commission provide staff and consultants with any feedback that you might have regarding our direction. You're not taking any direct action tonight. Again, this is just one of the 2 official scoping meetings that we're having to solicit public input. We're extremely interested in the comments from the public and from the Commission, again, to help guide our efforts. We're not here tonight necessarily to respond to questions or comments on the environmental impact report or the analysis tonight. Really, what we're here tonight is to listen and to take in questions and comments that will help guide our analysis over the next few months. It would be helpful if the Planning Commission could express some concurrence, especially over the draft alternatives that staff has put together and are contained within the staff report, and that you'll hear more about this evening. But it's not required, but certainly having that concurrence that we can then report back to the City Council on August 4th would be very helpful. And I think that is about all I wanted to mention before I introduce Joanna Jansen from PlaceWorks. PlaceWorks has been our consultant on the comprehensive plan update for many years now, and I think she is as excited as I am to finally get to this point of scoping meetings. So with that, I'll give it to Joanna.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a brief presentation to explain to the members of the Commission and the public what the EIR is that we're accepting scoping comments on tonight, and also briefly go over the alternatives that the initial concepts, rather, for the alternatives that we're hoping to more fully flesh out over the next few weeks, and that will be covered in the EIR. So Stephen's already told you that our goals for tonight are mainly to listen to the public and to the Commission and hear your comments. So with that, let me explain a little bit about what the EIR is. And I just want to, I'm going to talk about the content, purpose, timeline of the environmental review process, where are opportunities for public input, touch briefly on the concept of a program EIR, and then go through the topics that are going to be covered in the EIR we anticipate. So the EIR is an environmental impact report. It's required by state law, the California Environmental Quality Act. It explains the objectives of a given project, the location of a project, any actions that are proposed, and potential impacts that could occur to the environment, to existing conditions in the environment. And an EIR is also required to present feasible mitigation measures or alternatives to a given project that could reduce or avoid the impacts. In our case, the project that we're talking about on this slide is the update of the comprehensive plan, and I'll get into what that means a little bit later. So the purposes of the EIR are to disclose information about the project and about its potential impacts, as well as about possible mitigation measures, to provide an opportunity for public input, and to support the PTC and the City Council in making a decision about a given project. Again, in this case, that project would be the comprehensive plan update. We're looking at a timeline of going on over about the next year and a half. We've already issued what's called a notice of preparation. That's a form that states for members of the community and for all state and other public agencies that the city is preparing this document, and it gives everyone a chance to respond to the city and say, as you're preparing this important environmental document, here are the topics that you really need to make sure you address. And this meeting tonight is an important part of that process. So that notice of preparation, or NOP, was issued on May 30th. Public agencies had until June 30th to give us their comments about what the EIR should cover, and the public has until August 6th to give similar comments, including at tonight's hearing. So again, this is not comments necessarily on the project, but comments on what the environmental impact analysis needs to keep in mind. It floods behind my house, there's terrible traffic at this intersection, you need to keep in mind this important special status species. Those are the types of comments that we can receive during this scoping period about what we need to cover during the EIR. And then once we have a full set of comments and everyone's had a chance to make sure that we have heard from them about what the EIR needs to cover, we'll be conducting the analysis later this year through the end of the year. And we're aiming to publish the draft EIR containing all of this analysis at the end of the year in December 2014. And then that public review period, there will be yet another public review period for people to review all of the information in the EIR. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with what an EIR is. It's often a very lengthy, very detailed document. So we have 60 days. Right now we're anticipating at least a 60-day public review period. That will be for the community as well as for any other public agencies that want to review and comment on the draft EIR. The next slide just gives kind of a visual diagram of the process that I just described, highlighting, again, the areas for public input, which is one of the key functions of an EIR. So right now we're on the first column on the left, we're in that white box of the 30-day scoping period, which is for the community members is actually a 69-day scoping period lasting until August 6th. And then we will be working on conducting the environmental review and publishing the draft EIR, moving into another public review period. After that second public review period on the draft EIR itself closes, then we will be working with city staff to respond to the comments, and the city is required to respond to each comment individually in what's called a final EIR. There is then yet another public review phase for that final EIR document to review how all of the comments have been responded to. And once that document is published, then the PTC can hold their hearings to review the final EIR and make a recommendation to council. And then the final step is for the city council to certify the EIR and approve a project. So that approval will be obviously contingent upon the information that's disclosed in the draft EIR, and will likely be some version of one or more of the alternatives that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So the approval would be an adoption of an updated comprehensive plan. When we're doing an EIR on a plan, especially a plan that affects an area as large as the entire city of Palo Alto, we do what's called a program or programmatic EIR, and that's distinguished from a project-level EIR. A project-level EIR deals with a specific site or a certain number of parcels. You will have diagrams of exactly what the buildings are going to look like on the parcel, where the parking is going to be, where the entrances and exits are, which trees would be kept or removed, a very high level of detail about that specific project. And the EIR on that project would look at that level of detail, look at site-specific analyses of hydrology or biological resources or cultural resources, and then identify and mitigate any particular impacts for that project. When we're looking at a document like the comprehensive plan, obviously it's much more difficult to say exactly how a given parcel would be developed or where a particular driveway cut would be. We don't look at the city in that level of detail. In a programmatic EIR, we're looking much more conceptually at what type of development would be allowed and where. And although there is a quantified analysis of things like traffic impacts and air quality impacts, there are not site-specific studies for any particular parcel. So it's a much more conceptual level of detail in a programmatic EIR. And because of that, additional development projects that go forward under the comprehensive plan would then, depending on what type of project they are, require additional levels of environmental analysis, and that's the point where you would get this site-specific level of detail. So that's just a little bit about the difference between a project-level EIR and a programmatic EIR, like the one we'll be preparing for the comprehensive plan update. Both EIRs, no matter what level of detail they're at, both types of EIRs, including the programmatic EIR, have a similar list of topics that they address. And again, these are established in the California Environmental Quality Act. So this is a list of the topics that we anticipate addressing in the EIR. Again, it focuses on impacts to the existing physical environment, and it covers, as you can see, a very wide range of topics, including some topics that are perhaps slightly less about the physical environment, like the public services sections, which look not only at the physical environment, but also at the services provided by the city and to serve development. So what your EIR is going to cover is a range of alternatives. You can go ahead, Elena. And these alternatives are part of your packet tonight in their very initial preliminary form. They have been the result, where we are today is the result of a series of meetings that have been held over about the past month and a half or so, since May 29th. The EIR, as I've mentioned, is going to cover each one of the alternatives in the same level of detail, which is rather unusual and innovative for an EIR on a comprehensive plan. And so it's worthwhile to explain a little bit about what those alternatives are and how they're shaping up so far. So we've had a series of 3 meetings with the public, and I see a lot of familiar faces from those meetings, so thank you all for continuing to be involved in the process. We're very grateful for your time. We've had meetings starting on May 29th, June 10th, and June 24th that built on each other, and I'm going to speak briefly about each one of those. At the first meeting, we talked about critical issues, and we asked small groups to complete a SWOT exercise to consider Palo Alto's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And a number of common themes emerged from the groups in each one of those 4 categories. including the importance of maintaining Palo Alto's high quality of life, building on and taking advantage of the unique relationship with Stanford, addressing concerns about traffic congestion and public trust, reaching out to citizens and making sure that they're integrated and engaged in this process, concerns about the high cost of housing, both rental and ownership, and interest in high-speed rail or Caltrain electrification, both as a threat and an opportunity. There were a number of other critical issues that were identified through the SWOT exercise. These are just some of the highlights that we heard from many of the small groups. The complete feedback from that website, from that meeting and all of the meetings is available on the general plan, the comp plan update website. So if we go to the next page, you can just see an example of the online engagement that is also possible on both this topic and the opportunity sites topic that I'll address in just a second, in a way, as one of the ways of reaching out to citizens who can't take 3 hours out of their evening to come to a meeting. We have put up online versions of several of the exercises that we've done at the workshops, and this is just one of those exercises. So if you go to the project website, or if you scan this QR code with your telephone, then you can get immediately to this online tool, and we're definitely still taking input, and we're welcome additional input through the online tools that are available. So after working on some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats at the first workshop, we then moved to talking about potential growth in Palo Alto, what's projected for the region and for Palo Alto, what do other California cities do to manage growth, and then we asked small groups to get together and look at maps of Palo Alto and brainstorm about areas that might potentially be appropriate to accommodate change and which areas should be preserved over the next 15 years during the life of the updated comprehensive plan. So if we see on the next slide, there is an example of what one of those table maps look like after the small group discussion. And then looking at all 4 of the small group table maps that were created, staff and consultants worked together to collate those into a synthesized map of 6 specific opportunity site areas that we focused on then at the third workshop. I'm noticing that the up top of this map is a little bit cut off, so I apologize for that. But there is also an area including the Stanford Shopping Center, downtown, the entirety of the El Camino Real corridor, the California Avenue area, the Stanford Research Park area, the East Meadow Circle and Bayshore area, and then the San Antonio Road area as the 6 opportunity site areas that came out of the small group work at workshop number 2. And then so at workshop number 3, we asked the participants there to look at those areas and think about, for each of those areas, what are some different alternative ways that they might develop. And to help spur that conversation, we provided 3 potential alternatives, very conceptual, and offered participants the chance to respond to those alternatives and revise them, or to create their own new alternative. So we had about 70 people, ended up working in about 9 small groups, and each one of those groups came up with a slightly different variation on the alternatives. Some groups created completely new alternatives. I think we had two groups that chose that alternative, that chose to create their new alternative. Other groups worked with one of the 3 preliminary alternatives that we had suggested and then made changes and refinements to that. So at the end of that workshop, we then took the feedback from those groups and tried to synthesize them into the draft alternatives that you have to consider tonight. Before I move on to talking about those, I just want to note that in addition to the workshop, the face-to-face workshop, again, online right now, we have this tool where we are still collecting input about these particular opportunity sites, what role they should play in the city in 2030, what they should look like, what policies or programs might be necessary to achieve your vision for these areas 15 years from now. So again, that's ongoing, and we welcome continued input with that online tool. So from all these sources, we have now the 4 alternatives that are described in greater detail in your staff report. They, before I start talking about each one of them individually, I just want to stress that all alternatives would preserve existing open space areas and existing areas that are zoned R1. We've heard very clearly through this process the importance of residential neighborhoods and the importance of open space to Palo Alto's character and its quality of life. And so none of the alternatives would include changes in those areas. The alternatives include a do-nothing alternative. In CEQA, this is called the quote-unquote no project alternative. That doesn't mean that nothing would happen between now and 2015. It means that none of the existing regulatory documents would be changed. So the project that we've been talking about is an update to the comprehensive plan. Under the no project alternative, the existing comprehensive plan and existing zoning would all stay in place as they are. Number 2 would slow, concept number 2 would slow non-residential development and allow some modest housing growth. That's contrasted with concept number 3, which would slow non-residential development, but would not discourage housing growth or limit it, but would rather focus it in areas that are served by transit. And then finally, concept number 4, is somewhat less about the location of development or the type of development and more about ensuring that new development is coupled with exploring potential new net zero impact concepts. And I'll talk a bit more about each one of these briefly, and that'll be the end of my presentation. So again, under the concept number 1, the do-nothing alternative, existing comprehensive plan policies and zoning designations would be in place, and those designations do allow for some new development. So new development would go on. It would go on under the existing policies that are in place. Under those existing policies, the city is already poised to see a relatively slow change in the types of uses along El Camino Real. The California Avenue area would continue to see the types of, there would be nothing to change the types of development projects that are being proposed in the California Avenue area. Existing job centers like the East Meadow Circle area or the Stanford Research Park would remain job centers and would not have any housing or other types of uses added to them. And again, in the staff report, there is a much greater detail about each one of these alternatives. Under concept number 2, we would slow non-residential development. Housing growth would be focused on that is necessary to meet state requirements. And there would be no change to existing land use designations. So under both this alternative and the next alternative, concept 3, the city would adopt a new procedure for metering the pace of office and R&D projects over 10,000 square feet. This is an opportunity for me to emphasize that these concepts are all very preliminary at this point. Their ideas are still percolating about what the concept should be. We're here to hear from you tonight. We're going to be hearing from the council on August 4th. The particular mechanism, for example, for regulating office growth, the legality of that mechanism, the accommodation of the Permit Streamlining Act, all of those types of details would definitely have to be worked out, and they are not worked out yet. So when we have the alternative and when we do the EIR, those are details that are definitely going to have to be fleshed out before we begin the EIR analysis. We're not quite there yet. We're still working on forming these alternatives. But in this alternative, again, we would focus residential growth on meeting state requirements and limiting residential growth really to that kind of bare minimum that would be needed to meet state requirements. There would not be a significant change to the existing character or mix of uses in downtown or along Cal Avenue or in any of the places that are primarily job-oriented right now, like the Research Park, East Meadow Circle. And along El Camino, the character would be a little bit more lower density, increased setbacks away from the road, 3-story height limit, for example, on new development. Concept number 3 would similarly slow non-residential development, but in the case of residential development, it would shift residential development capacity from existing residentially zoned areas to areas that are within a half-mile of Caltrain or BRT stations. So the capacity would essentially be downzoned in many areas in order to upzone those areas that are within a half mile of the transit stations and accommodate increased development there as a way of further strengthening protections for existing single-family residential areas. Also, under this alternative, we might test the possibility of depressing the Caltrain tracks from San Antonio to Page Mill Road. And we would downtown would change to add more housing, adding housing also along El Camino Real, and not along Cal Avenue itself, but in the area around Cal Avenue, and in the research park, most likely along El Camino, again, in areas that are particularly close to the BRT stations or otherwise well served with transit. And then finally, in concept 4, there would not be growth management instruments added, such as a restriction on new office and R&D development, but instead the city would adopt policies to address the impacts of that new development, whether it would be from the vehicle trips that the development would generate, the greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, energy consumption. Net zero is a very broad concept that could be applied to many different aspects of development. As part of that project, or that alternative rather, we would consider mixed-use projects along El Camino, and some of those could even go over 50 feet in height. That might be in exchange for providing a certain type of housing or achieving a certain net zero goal that the city established. And the research park in particular might see the greatest amount of change under this alternative, becoming a proving ground or a testing ground for a whole range of concepts that might include additional bike sharing programs, urban farming programs, alternative energy generation, water conservation programs. So the research park as a test case for a lot of net zero concepts under this particular alternative. Before I end, I just want to briefly explain what the process of these alternatives is. We've already done step 1 of synthesizing the input that we heard from the workshops. We're now in step 2, presenting the draft alternatives to you and to the City Council. Again, once the alternatives are better fleshed out and we have a little bit more input on how they're evolving, then we will need to assign specific estimates of the quantity and type of development to each alternative so that it can be analyzed in the EIR, including traffic modeling, air quality modeling, noise modeling, and other quantitative analyses. And then again, each one of those 4 alternatives will be analyzed at an equal level of detail in the draft EIR, which we hope to publish at the end of this year. And I believe that concludes my presentation. So again, as Stephen mentioned, we're here to hear from the public and for you on the topics of the EIR and on the content of the alternatives if you have that input.
So thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Let's now open the public hearing, and we'll allow anybody from the public who submitted a speaker card an opportunity to speak. We're thinking this is an important topic, and we want to definitely give you enough time to share your thoughts or raise questions. So individuals will have, typically we give 3 minutes, we give you up to 5 minutes. And if you're here on behalf of a group, then you can have longer. I think there's at least one such representative give you 9 or 10 minutes. Anyway, so Vice Chair Keller, who's first?
Our first speaker is Nielsen Buchanan, and is he on behalf of a group?
Yes.
So I guess I'll give you 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I brought a companion here. If I could take his 5, I won't be greedy.
My name is Michael Griffin. I'm yielding my time to my comrade in arms here.
I want to thank all of you and all the people that have been working on the process so far for the comp plan, which has got to be one of the most nebulous documents to describe to someone there is. There's one thing for sure for me is this will be certainly one of the best vetted comp plans in a long time. The input I got as talking to sort of the middle management neighborhood folks out there is that that's all and good. I don't want to get involved. It'll be updated by people brighter than I am and no more, and it will then go back into the usual dead document file that'll be used heavily by people who know how to manipulate the system. And nothing wrong with that, but it's not I haven't heard of anybody in the country that has a dynamic comp plan. And something is missing for me, that there's got to be a companion to the comp plan. And I've talked to the real experts, and I still don't understand what it could be. Maybe it's a set of concept plans for the critical areas of the city. Maybe it's the precise plan features that's sprinkled out along to hit the future pressure points that we know are coming. So that's all I've got to say about the comp plan. I'm glad I'm not involved. A more serious issue is your effort to engage people in the city planning, and the comp plan is just one of those engagements. And as far as launching one, I think you've done about everything that you could expect to be done, and it will be done better and all that stuff. But I, for the life of me, I haven't been able to figure out how do you keep people engaged. The comp plan itself is not an engaging document, in my opinion. But as I homed in on this and talked to a few people and said, please take a look at this, there's one thing that began to excite people, and that was these very rough scenarios that are coming out through the EIR process. And what I would urge is that if you're looking for a role to take on, that you ought to periodically stop and take a look at the 2 to 3 to 4 scenarios that are going to come out of this and have them renewed periodically. Take them back to the public and get comments on just how does this grab you, because each one of those scenarios, elements of each one of them, excite somebody. I don't think there's a single scenario, but there are elements in each one that I guarantee you will fill up rooms if you properly vet that. And that would be a real interesting way, I think, to keep people engaged. I have about 8 points here tonight, but I'm only going to cover about 4 or 5 of them. In fact, I'm going to steal ideas that I hear tonight, and I'm going to rewrite them accordingly. None of that scenario development and refinement can happen, in my opinion, and I've said this publicly many times, with the current staffing of the planning department. There needs to be a dedicated data division, and that actually spells out 3D. But any normal corporation in America today has forward-looking, has people that can capture good data and look forward. And Hillary needs somebody dedicated, or I don't know how much, and it's not my job to worry about how much, that does nothing more than create data, see where we are for baselines, and then make high, low, and medium projections whenever possible. That would drive those scenarios in a very healthy fashion. So I don't think we can get from where we are to where we want to be without a stronger reliance on professional data. That basically, you got to have the tools of the trade. And I just want to close on one of my pet projects, because it's going to test the mettle of the city. Let me step back, because I had a good chance to get some education from Steve Levy about something I think is the overwhelming driver of what we're into. If the regional GDP is growing at, Steve, 5, 6, 7%, the stress on the cities is a couple of points below that. That's real refined advice from the economist. And that's creating enormous pressure on every city and town from the Bay Area, of the Southern Bay Area, from Oakland down to San Jose. And I don't think we've begun to deal with the political and social impacts from the last couple of years and what I think is the next 2 years. And that's going to create an enormous stress. And let me just illustrate that by whatever's going on in Menlo Park. We'll know a little bit more next week on what this city council does with the reaction from Save Menlo Park. And I'm not going to take sides one way or the other. We had our own Maybell situation. There's Balance, Palo, Balance, Mountain View going on, of trying to figure out what their balance between office and housing and density, and very creative work is going to come out of that. I had a chance to talk 2 hours with people down there yesterday. And I've said it over again, I just don't want to throw our city into mass confusion and hate and discontent. But we're creeping up there on that. Downtown parking is going to be a problem. The parking permit issue is not permit parking. It's the quality of neighborhood issue. And I'm not going to go into that because we're going to have a chance to vet that very soon. And we have an election coming up, and whatever this election is, I think it's going to be mild compared to the election in 2016 because of the economic drivers and the social and political consequences. I hope I'm going to conclude with that remark, and I don't want it to be negative. It just means that's another factor you need to be thinking about. I don't think the comp plan can address that. It's the intermediate planning processes and how the council and you operate vis-a-vis the citizens that come forward. So I wish you the best. I know there are a lot of people in Palo Alto who want to make this a constructive process. I especially do. Thank you.
Michael Griffin, do you want to take any of the remaining time? Thank you. Okay, the next speaker is Shani Kleinhaus, to be followed by Stephen Rosenblum.
Thank you. I'm Shani Kleinhaus. I'm a resident of Palo Alto and the environmental advocate for Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society. So I'm going to talk about birds a little bit and about things that concern me as a resident as well. So one of the things that we saw in Hillary's presentation was thought were critical issues, and it talks about quality of life. So I think there is some kind of an assumption that birds and nature is part of quality of life. Not that it is not, but it has its own value. And that was mentioned in several of the tables there, that there is an intrinsic value to nature that is not associated with human benefits or quality of life that needs to be recognized. And the reason I mention that is because in the comments that I have provided previously on the natural element of the comprehensive plan, there were a lot of comments that we tried, my group, to enter about how do we make this a bird-friendly city. And that included how do we plant and how do we trim trees and what kind of windows we have and what do you do in the natural areas, but also how do you make our city a living city not only for people. And people love birds. We have a lot of birders. We have a lot of people that have a bird feeder in the backyard. We don't want to lose that. This is the only connection that people still in a city can have to nature is birds. So how do you improve that? That needs to be a part of the general plan or the comprehensive plan, and not only as a quality of life issue. And a few other notes. So I want to go back to the 4 concepts and the concept 4 that has innovative net zero concept, and I'm trying to figure out what that means. I don't think it's clear. I think it was really good to have a story about it in the newspaper today, thank you, but it's still not clear what this means. And I'm not clear whether this is kind of an experiment on a citywide scale, which would be really scary because it could be an outcome that is not what we expect at all. And it could be a mitigation that is actually presented as a general plan, and that is not right either. So I think it's a really interesting concept and could be done on one neighborhood. I would love to see it at East Meadow Circle, which is really close to my house. And I think that could be a good example, but I would not try to adopt that as an alternative to a general plan or a comprehensive plan. I have followed some of the processes in Mountain View very, very closely and what was going on in terms of how the North Bayshore area, where they have a lot of offices, is going to deal with increase. And there were a lot of concepts that they tried to figure out. How do we stop growth of car trips? How do we stop emissions? What are the other alternatives? So far, a lot of creative solutions, none of them works to actually have net zero. They just don't work. So there probably is no solution like that. It would be wonderful to try and find one, but not on a city scale. It has to be an experiment that is much smaller in scale. And as a resident of near East Meadow Circle, I just want to go back to that specific plan to that site and say that I would love to see more housing there. I think that to use the circle for housing and the center for services and park would be a wonderful thing instead of what's there right now. And a lot of people came in the last 10 years to live there. Initially, there was a response from some of the neighbors who did not like it, but I see that they're really assimilated into the neighborhood very well, and it's a really nice neighborhood and to have these people live there. What else do I have? So the last thing I want to say is something about the process. When something is now decided, if it's an alternative is moving forward or something in the EIR is decided, yeah, we're moving forward with that, there is no way back, almost. It's almost impossible, and the people in the audience might not know this. Once something moves forward, going and saying, well, you know, we're only studying this, so let's study what the impact is. The study is not whether or not to do something, the study is how to do something. So once it's in there, it's not coming out. And we've had at Audubon some big issues with that and did manage to get some things out of EIRs at the last moment. But it's almost impossible to change a plan after it's sent in motion. And the EIR will not study whether or not something is a good idea. It will only study how to do it and what kind of cost it's going to cost all of us and mitigate for that to some extent, not completely. Thank you.
The next speaker is Stephen Rosenblum, to be followed by Kevin Murray.
Hi, my name's Steve Rosenblum. I live in Palo Alto as well. I just wanted to bring up an issue that is a vision issue, I think, and belongs in this study because of its overarching effect on life in Palo Alto, and that is the undergrounding of Caltrain. I think, to me, it represents an opportunity and a solution to many problems. If the Caltrain right-of-way were underground, it would immediately improve the connectivity between east and west sides of Palo Alto. People could cross the train tracks on any street again the way they used to be able to before the grade crossings were there. It would create real estate above the train tracks, which would be accessible to transportation. It would possibly create a bikeway, depending on how the land were used, and also opportunities to build housing and commercial, depending on how it was zoned. And this is really a way of creating real estate, something which God usually doesn't do except in places like Hawaii. We can actually get real estate back that wasn't existing. And some of the other aspects of it, it would eliminate traffic delays that we have now at the crossings, leading to a lot less loss in time of people waiting, and concomitantly would allow Caltrain to increase frequency of service because they would no longer be limited by gate down time. So this would enhance transit in both ways, both mass transit and vehicular and pedestrian transit, because of having no more traffic delays. It would also eliminate accidents at grade crossings, as well as suicides, which we've had many in the past. And so I think that's another improvement. And it would also eliminate the train noise from our environment. This would include the mechanical noise of the train as well as the horn noise, which they're required to sound at every grade crossing. So that would improve quality of life for all people living next to the tracks. And then as a final thing, it would prepare the way for undergrounding of high-speed rail should it eventually come to Palo Alto. And from what I'm understanding from the latest planning, in contradiction to what high-speed rail had said early on, is that they plan to retain grade crossings even when the trains are going by at 125 miles an hour, which I think is not very sensible. I think it's a real threat to our environment as well as to our life and limb. So I think I commend this as an idea to the consideration of the Commission, and that they should consider this as part of their planning process. Thank you.
The next speaker is Kevin Murray, to be followed by Beth Bunenberg. Is Kevin here?
I think he spoke earlier.
Okay, great. So,
timing. Hi, Kevin Murray, 2091 Harvard. I was listening to all of the presentation. Thank you. I've read the plans. I heard the presentation out on the TV. Let me emphasize this commission. First, in terms of process, as a political scientist, I'm disappointed to hear that you're appointed by council members. I want you to be more independent. So maybe we can revisit that process. Second, I'm not really aware of any of the people in the commission are in any way related to commercial development or attorneys related to intellectual property rights. Hopefully there's no connection there either. Again, independence is critical because those are like the two triads that make up what is driving Silicon Valley. Of the 4 plans, number 2 resonates with me the most. I would even like stricter allocations, however. With respect to ABAG, remember, the more companies we allow to expand in Palo Alto, the more ABAG will pressure us to bring in housing. Now, I know we can do plans for housing, but we don't have to build the housing. So that's the good news. That's the good caveat, and hopefully we can stay with that. Mr. Tanaka spoke earlier about the fact, and I appreciate your comments, trying to be inclusive, that we have to be maybe sensitive to the investment concerns of these commercial developers. Hey, folks, come on. They're here to invest and get a return. It's really about power, money, control, glory. And I, for one, as a Palo Alton, representing the citizens' voice rather than the commercial interests, want to preserve the quality of life we have here. In my humble opinion, your only role should be focusing on how do you manage the existing development rather than plan for future development. Now, we're going to hear a lot of survey questions discussing about, look at the growth trends. I know we're living in a second gold rush boom right now, and have been. In fact, I saw it in 1984. To me, the traffic levels were too bad in 1984 when I lived here. Of course, I've been here since 1960. In the last 15 years, my God, what happened to the leadership? They just surrendered. They surrendered to the financial interests. Our only power is numbers. I know that. And if we get enough of us with people in seats, the rest of the Palo Altons here, it will change. But the true change only comes with electing a whole new slate of non-developers in the city council. And then they would direct this commission to come up with ways on how to manage our existing traffic. Push the success, the financial success, which I celebrate, of Silicon Valley out of Palo Alto. Shift it to San Jose, where it deserves the redevelopment. And for those urbanites that want to have that world experience, that's great. We want to get you to move to San Francisco, and we want you to get you to move to San Jose and enjoy those days. But for us, who still want to feel like we live in a community, this is the new sea change. So the closest one for a voice for the sea change is item number 2. Item number 2. With respect to granite units, I own 3 of those granite units. And I applaud Mr. Keller's earlier remark. Sure, if you want to rezone it so that some existing property owners can do granite units on their existing properties, that might be one way to accommodate housing crunch. Palo Alto has become an executive community in terms of the pricing of the real estates. The homes are nothing to applaud, but that's okay. That was the World War II generation that picked up on the mass development of Middlefield. I remember Middlefield was literally a field prior to the Eichlers. But the housing values have so skyrocketed that we've got to be realistic that really, again, note, the success of the Silicon Valley really needs to be pushed out to other communities, not only in California, but throughout the nation. The challenge here, of course, is, and I don't blame them, venture capitalists, they want to talk to one another and go across town. They're all centered here. And again, so are the law firms and so are the startups. And they, in their mind's eye, they think that they need to be a part of the action. And understandably, the real estate development says that's right and will facilitate that by giving them the infrastructures to succeed. We know what they're doing here. But it's gotten out of control. It's beyond even reasonable. So it is my passion and hope that the only thing that will get passed here will be item number 2 vision. And I thank you for the time it must have taken to go through all of the input. So for a voice of Palo Altans, who really comes from the numbers, not from the domestic and foreign investment that's driving the incredible expansion that I've ever seen in the history of this town, this will be a voice helping to coordinate a new city council slate to redirect the direction of this commission to plan for the existing density and no more. Thanks for your time. I certainly appreciate it. Good night.
The next speaker is Beth Bunenberg, to be followed by, Robert Moss.
Beth Bunenberg, speaking tonight as an individual. I am a Palo Alto resident. In terms of vision, I don't envision Palo Alto in 30 years as a collection of skyscrapers that blocks our views of the coastal hills and the bay. We are locked into our present land area, and there aren't any more suburbs for us to annex. Therefore, we must use our land very wisely. I favor the option that actually was presented by our group at the Elks Lodge, which was a double slow growth on residential, slow growth on non-residential. We already have projects in the pipeline that are greatly going to increase traffic and parking problems. Now, history has shown that putting too many people jammed together too tightly, and the quality of life goes down. Already, Palo Alto, or at this point, Palo Alto has a pretty good balance between residential and parkland. But still, there are traffic jams, tempers flare, people fight over parking places, and pedestrians are hurt and killed on our streets. We love that parkland, and yet we continue to see some threats to those parklands. I strongly recommend keeping the 50-foot height limit and sticking to it. Place those 50-foot high buildings in areas such as Stanford Industrial Park and the southern part of El Camino. Keep the buildings of human scale, both residential and non-residential. Please accept the double slow alternative, and let's keep our quality of life. Thank you.
The next speaker is Robert Moss, to be followed by C. Reddy.
Thank you. A couple of comments. In the list of topics, one of the things that's missing is the potential flooding from sea level rise. Under hydrology, you should be considering that, because it's almost certain that within 20 years the sea is going to go up by more than a foot. And a rise of that amount will flood most of Palo Alto between the Bay and Middlefield. So talk about that. You don't just ignore it. Second, in the hazardous materials, the staff report talked about having a report from 2003. That's old data. I have ones from 2005, and I know they've been issued from 2010. Furthermore, the toxic levels for TCE were significantly reduced about 18 months ago. So something that would have been acceptable 3 or 4 years ago is not acceptable, and the mitigations are different today than they would have been then. Keep that in mind when you start talking about building in the CO area in particular. Now, on the various concepts, the two that I think are the most realistic are, number one, keep the existing comprehensive plan. We spent years getting that developed. We don't have to come up with a revised comprehensive plan for a few years. Let's live with what we've got. But if you want to make some changes, concept 2 makes more sense than the others. One of the things that bothers me about concept 3 and to a certain extent concept 4 is you're talking about allowing densification within a half a mile of the transit routes. ABAG is only asking for densification within a quarter mile of transit routes. A half mile would include almost all of Barron Park, Evergreen Park. I could name the neighborhoods going up and down El Camino, which would be impacted by increasing density along there. The City Council supposedly adopted a basic principle that all existing R1 zones shall not have an increase in density. That must be adhered to. No ifs, no ands, no changes. The same with the 50-foot height limit. There's no reason why you can't build housing within 50 feet. I could show you hundreds of housing units along El Camino and other major streets that are 50 feet or less. The reason that the CN zone has a lower height limit is because we wanted it to be compatible with the housing behind it in Barron Park. We didn't want 50-foot height limits. Now, when you talk about housing developments and you're asking to put in developments that have studio and one-bedroom units, find out what the market wants, because you may find the market hates studio one-bedroom units. Let me give you two examples. There's a townhouse development on El Camino Way just north of Charleston, and there's another one on San Antonio just east of what used to be Mayfield Mall. Both of those were developed with the allowed FAR, but between half and two-thirds the number of housing units that would have been allowed. And the developers were asked, why did you build these big units, 2,000, 2,500 square feet? And the answer was, that's what the market wants. The market doesn't want 800 square foot units. The market doesn't want one-bedroom units. So find out what the market wants. Don't tell the market what it ought to be doing. The market's going to tell you. When you talk about changing El Camino, I get very nervous, because one of the things you're talking about is getting all of the property owners to band together and combine lots and work as a group. Been there, done that, it crashed and burned. We tried that in the Barron Park Association years ago. For any 25 properties along El Camino, you will find there are at least 30 property owners, some of whom don't talk to each other. So unless you can actually get somebody to come in and buy up the properties and combine them, you're not going to be doing that. You're going to have individual properties developed one at a time. And as an example, there's a vacant lot just south of Matadero. It's been vacant for more than 40 years, since the building that was on there burned. Jim Bear was trying to buy that and develop it as a hotel about 25 years ago. And found out that the person who owns it lives in Texas, and the amount that she wanted for it, he considered grossly excessive. And that was years ago, decades ago. So you're going to find 4146 El Camino, which has now come in with another development. This is the fourth development they've come in on that property. It's owned by a woman in Hong Kong. She's had 2 projects approved. Both of them were never built. The approvals expired because she never went forward and actually built them. So getting things done along El Camino is very different from getting things done under normal development projects.
Our final speaker, unless we have additional cards, is C. Reddy.
Thanks for taking me in. I came in late. A few things that I would like this team to talk about and include or consider is the Stanford Hospital expansion. No, it's Stanford, and they're doing what they're already doing. So how would we incorporate whatever traffic, whatever things that happen, the 24-hour emergency services, all that? So we probably need to, I'm sure you already thought about it, but I just would like to put it as a list of things that we need to talk about. And then East Palo Alto. You know, we don't live in an isolated world. And I've seen this in Manhattan Beach. You know, when we had riots in 1991, Rodney King, all that. So there was Hawthorne, and there was Manhattan Beach. It was only 2 miles, very similar to here. You know, it's only about half a mile to East Palo Alto. So we need to lift up that community so that we can live peacefully as well. We're not living in an isolated world. So I think any of our planning, we need to work with them. Same thing with Mountain View. Same thing with next door Menlo Park. So we're not in an isolated community. What they do impacts us, what we do impacts them. I think I'm more concerned about what they do that we may not be able to understand. So I think that discussion like Stanford would help. And the other one is when I look up on the sky, you know, Palo Alto is a beautiful community and all that. I used to live in Newport, and I see there are restrictions on air traffic. It seemed like the planes come, above us and go to wherever they go. I haven't researched whether they go to Oakland or go to San Francisco. I think that needs to be looked at it. The more traffic that comes through, it's going to wake us up. If an airplane, unfortunately, could have a mechanical damage, things like that. It's going to severely impact our life. So we need to participate there. We need to give our inputs. Maybe they could take an alternate path later at night. But I see planes beyond 10, 11 o'clock at night. Which wasn't the case in Newport. We had restrictions. And then I think this is very important to me. As we get older, we need to have an alternate way of going to doctor. My 5-mile zone is Stanford and Menlo Park, and we need to allow some other medical care facilities other than Stanford, big Stanford. Not everybody can afford to go to Stanford; they're more expensive, and senior citizens might need alternative means of getting that medical care without having to drive. What I call a taxi drive. If they need to go, they can take a taxi and go $20 and go to the hospital. It's very important to the community. And a lot of people have a lot of money, but a lot of people don't. Seniors are more frugal too, and caregivers and all that that need to be considered. Last thing is beautification of El Camino. El Camino Real is not the prettiest thing, and I was totally surprised when I saw what's on El Camino and south of Page Mill Road. It's quite different than what we see on the north side. So I think we are one city, one community. I think we need to consider lifting that community up, that look of that area up. Thank you.
Can I turn in a card? Or
Yes.
just speak?
Speak, and then you can turn in a card. So, Stephen Levy, you will have 5 minutes.
So I'm Steve, and I live about a block from here in Palo Alto. In terms, Joanna and Steve, of the scoping plan, the EIR, my experience is that the analysis goes forward if you have really specific alternatives. I'm sure you know that. We're at a conceptual level. You've got people arguing growth or no growth, but without numbers on those 4 alternatives, not on individual parcels, but on the program, you can't do your EIR, right? You can't do the impacts, and nobody here is going to know what happens. So that's the first piece. You know that piece. But there's a second issue, and I've been talking to Hillary and Steve back and forth. I don't know what is discretionary for the commission and the council and what is legal. What is legal under the existing comp plan. That is how much growth the city can expect unless they do something that violates the law. I think that will inform the discussion in the following way. It will move it to a discussion of where are the best locations and what are the best mitigation measures to handle the amount of growth that is legally entitled now, as opposed to an argument that may not be realistic about stopping growth altogether. I don't know the answer, but I think going forward, you all need to be informed about what is legal. I remember Stephen and Joanna at the last meeting, I think, Stephen, you said there's a lot of development capacity generally in the city. Maybe not in downtown, but I heard that correctly. So those two things together will bring a lot of specificity to this. Third, for the scoping plan, I think the public deserves to know what it costs to do the mitigation. Okay? Just saying something's there, undergrounding Caltrain is a huge expense. I think we need to know the cost. In terms of the alternatives, I have 2 suggestions. One, the documents you passed out talk alternately about neighborhood retail and neighborhood services. I think probably the correct concept to think about is services. We have a big shopping center. We have a smaller town and country. Most areas have a grocery store or a CVS or something. What makes those neighborhoods walkable is a bank and a dry cleaner and a UPS store and a place to get a haircut and tailored,
restaurants, but all of those services, I think we focus too much on the commute trips and not enough on reducing walkable evening and daytime trips for services that people take, not the commute trips. The last point, I think the half mile a bus stop or transit is not quite the best way to think about it. When I see Caltrain and those people getting off, they're getting off to go to jobs, and it works because half of them walk downtown, half of them walk to the shuttle, a third and a third have bikes, okay? So I think if you were serious about what went around transit to reduce the commute, you'd put jobs, which goes in the face of what a lot of people want. It may not be a distinction with much merit, because it turns out that the transit stations are in downtown areas. And so you absolutely, I think, want to put your housing near where service is and everyday retail are to really reduce as much as possible the parking and net commuting of people who can then walk or bike to those services. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more speakers who have come later? I guess not.
So I'd like to thank members of the public who spoke this evening very much for your thoughtful comments. It's always humbling being on a commission in a city like Palo Alto where the collective IQ and knowledge base of the residents far exceeds our 7 appointed representatives on the commission. I think that is instrumental in getting to the best possible comprehensive plan update. So we're going to close the public hearing and then come back to the commission. And I think, given the importance of this topic, maybe we'll allow for 2 rounds of comments and take, say, up to 5 minutes in the first round, and then you don't have to take all that time. And if you have more, we'll give you a second chance. So who would like to begin? Commissioner Rosenblum.
Thank you. As opposed to the previous round, I may fill up my full time and have to go to the next time. I'm very passionate about this. So I want to divide comments into some high-level comments and some low-level comments. On the high-level side, one of my personal talking points is that this Palo Alto that everyone loves, and this sort of halcyon notion of walkable streets and low traffic and thriving businesses, and I think we had a number of people come up and refer to the Palo Alto of their youth. It's a system, and I think we need to realize that there's no growth or reduced growth imperils that system in some ways. So the Palo Alto of your youth, I'm sure, had teachers living in Palo Alto, maybe policemen living in Palo Alto. Different people could afford to live here. We have a demographic skew that now skews older and skews against young working people without families. That is different from the Palo Alto of your youth. And a no growth or negative growth policy exacerbates that difference. It makes it more expensive for young people to live here, especially if there are no jobs for them. So they're going to live here, pay a premium to have to commute somewhere else. And the interesting thing about young people is they go out every day. When I was a young person, I went out probably 2 times a day. So I'd eat my lunch out, eat my dinner out, maybe meet friends for drinks after work. I now have a young family. I go out maybe once a week. It's very nice that once a week I occasionally support our Palo Alto businesses, but they don't live off me. They live off the people who go there every day. And I benefit from that because I like walking to businesses, and all of us do. But we are in some ways, I don't want to call us free riders, but we benefit from the people who support businesses intensively. And when you make it more difficult for those people to go and support those businesses, it makes it more difficult for the businesses, which, by the way, are paying very high rents because we restrict commercial growth. So my one plea here is to recognize that there's a system. And we talk about changes from the past. A big change from the past, frankly, is that a lot of people look the same now. We're getting older and wealthier, and a lot of people can't afford to live here anymore. And it's not just a pity because a diverse place is, I think, an exciting place, but actually you need diversity to support diverse businesses. So that's sort of my high-level point. One other high-level point, I think it's important to put us into context. I don't think that we are a major city. I also don't think we're a suburb. We're an important college town. and we look at other important college towns, be it Pomona or Davis or San Luis Obispo, and I'm only naming California college towns, we're far less dense than any of them. And all of us can look up this data and see what our density is versus others. Even if you get rid of all of our open space and say I'm going to double Palo Alto density, we're still less dense than they are. They have found solutions to make livable places with colleges, with a vibrant ecosystem, manage growth in a healthy way. And so my second plea is let's use the data. It's available. We always complain there's not enough data for this or that. And that's true. A lot of data is outdated, and some data is not that useful. But there is certainly data to put this into context. So I'm going to jump into the specifics. But the plea is on the high level is engage in system-level thinking and innovate within our context. Use the data. On the specific, I think all the alternatives that have been mentioned, they all are couched in sort of low growth or anti-growth. I understand there's a certain environment where there is great suspicion of growth. Alternatives 3 and 4 anticipate some limited growth. I would say neither of them anticipate any non-residential growth. I think that's probably wrong. I think there needs to be a scenario where jobs are also created or at least explicitly addressed. Specifically, alternative 3 around the growth strategies limits building height to 55 feet if additional height is used for residential. I'm not sure how the additional 5 feet really helps to for residential. I've also heard from a number of people that for modern buildings, we now have higher ground floors. That a 60-foot limit is more palatable or more makes for a nicer building. I think that should also be considered. The 55 feet limit, I think, is just an odd limit. If we're going to violate historic precedent for 50 feet, then I think it should be a meaningful violation, so to speak. It should make a good building. I'd like to see something that contemplates a combination. Alternative 4 I view as orthogonal to the others, which is to try to go for a zero growth in trips strategy versus other growth strategies in terms of building square footage. I think that can be combined to try to limit trips and have a building area strategy. So I'd like to see kind of the crosstab of those. 27 University is only explicitly discussed in Alternative 4. I think that's such an important parcel. It has to be part, I think, of every plan. It's a big parcel. It's downtown. I think not talking about it is sort of an elephant in the room. And I'll say one more thing just quickly, and then I'll do the rest of my second piece. I agree with Bob Moss. Density drops within 0.25 miles of transit hubs. I think just saying 0.5 is kind of a cop-out, and the usefulness of transit, dense transit-oriented design, using that big of a radius, I think also is a bit of a cop-out. I think having more density but closer to transit makes more sense.
Commissioner Alcheck?
So one of the goals is to sort of determine consensus here on the commission's thoughts. I think if your plan is to prepare a summary for council that's similar to the summary you prepared tonight, you could add my name behind every single thing Commissioner Rosenblum just said in the bullet point list of comments. That was like a breath of fresh air, really. It was, I don't think I could have said anything you said better than the way you said it. We often use the word, so I'm going to take the same approach. I'm going to talk high-level plea and then some specifics. We often use the word developers. Yeah, we often use the word developers when we talk about some of the commercial projects that come our way. I really prefer the term redevelopment. And one of the reasons why is because I have a sincere distinction in my mind between, infill development and sprawl. And I think there's a lot of residents that are very interested in the notion of environmental protection, particularly when it comes to climate change. And our esteemed community members, Stephen Levy is here, and he knows better than probably everybody in this room what sort of growth California is going to see in the next 10, 20, 30 years, which is to say that he knows that it's astronomical. And so the solution is two things. We can create 7 more Fresnos between here and Los Angeles, which will devastate the environment of California. Correct me if I'm wrong. Not tonight. Not right. not at this moment in time. But I once read that California is home to 1 of every 8 Americans. Okay? It ought to be its own country. It's that massive. And when you think about that out loud and you think about the growth we're about to encounter, the notion of taking all of this open space and running water to it and running electricity to it and paving it with concrete is ludicrous. So every time I meet with an individual in the city and they express to me this notion that the 50-foot height limit is just daunting and they don't want to see any more homes being built and the density ideas are awful, I like to remind them that the growth is coming. Show me where you'd like it. And if you point to the foothills of Palo Alto, I'll tell you why I don't like putting it there. And so I like to refer to the developers as redevelopers. I like the idea of redeveloping these parcels in a way that enhances the density. I know that's not popular among the residentialists. I'd like to think that we have a diverse planning commission membership here because the city council wanted to hear different points of view. I think that's why I'm on this commission, frankly. Maybe because it pays to have that sort of urbanist perspective every once in a while. But I really just want to emphasize that it is an environmental issue where we will grow. And I walk downtown, I bike downtown more, and I'd like to think that if we increase the density, we'll encourage greater walking and biking. I don't doubt for 1 minute that even if we were to triple our residential development in this town, there would still end up being maybe 3 more Fresnos on the way to Los Angeles in the next 30 years. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter how much we're going to... The truth is our growth is probably not going to be adequate in any real way to make room for the growth, for the population increase. So there will be some impacts to the environment that are essentially unavoidable. But that is one of the biggest components of the way that I like to look at this concept of density, which is to say, well, where do we want to put it? And I don't think it's just about, well, what about Menlo Park and Mountain View and Sunnyvale and San Jose and San Francisco? I think every single one of these communities is essentially facing the same challenge. And to look at it as if we're really separate is myopic in my view. I think it's the one Bay Area, unfortunately. Our towns run into each other. And frankly, when one town next door makes significant inroads or makes significant decisions, it actually impacts us, right? The San Antonio development is going to impact Palo Alto's traffic situation. I'm just going to take 10 more seconds just to say that well, actually, you know what? I'll just wait till the next round.
Commissioner Tanaka.
So I think we've had some really good comments from the public as well as from the commissioners on this topic. I think it's a very important question, an issue that we're talking about. And I think the one comment I think I've heard that I think has been pretty consistent, whether it be pro-growth or keeping things exactly the way they are, is I think what's important is the quality of life. So I think that's one probably universal goal, which I don't think there's anyone in this room that would say, no, I want a decrease in quality of life. I don't think anyone's going to say that. I think, if anything, people want to increase the quality of life. And then the question, of course, is, well, what does that mean, right? Is quality of life meaning more growth or less growth? And I think Commissioner Rosenblum had a very good comment in that, Palo Alto from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s has grown, has changed, and that's part of the quality of life. I mean, the vibrancy that we get from Stanford, from the high-tech companies in this area, is a blessing. A large part is what made the many property owners in this room wealthy, to be honest. And so in terms of quality of life, I think we have to think about is how we get this quality of life by freezing everything. Is that how we get it? And everyone basically, as some of the other commissioners have mentioned, we basically slowly age into a retirement community. Is that the quality of life, the high quality of life that we all are accustomed to? Or is it having a diverse, vibrant city that welcomes all walks of life and allows opportunities for everyone? And I'm more into the favor of, I think we want a diversity that allows opportunities for all, not just the privileged few who came here first. So I think that's something that we have to think about. Now, with that said, I do think that having protecting the R1 areas makes total sense. I think we want to do that. I don't think there's anyone here that's saying that we build a 100-foot skyscraper in the middle of R1 neighborhood. I mean, I for one had not voted for the Mayville project, mainly because it was a 4-story building near a R1 neighborhood. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But so I think that's something which I think protection of that is important, because I think that does protect quality of life. But at the same time, I think everyone here enjoys having a grocery store near their neighborhood. They enjoy having services near them. They enjoy being able to shop and walk to those places. And I think enabling that to happen is important. And enabling that to happen sometimes means a certain amount of density. So I've heard this a lot. And I think Palo Alto is probably, at least the citizens, think of themselves as one of the greenest places on earth. But if you look at per capita compared to, let's say, a city like Manhattan, not suggesting that we should be Manhattan, but per carbon footprint of a person in Manhattan, it's much lower than any suburb like Palo Alto, because they take transit, they don't drive, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why. And one of the comments I think Stephen Levy mentioned, and I've read it from so many different areas, is that jobs near transit actually reduces the carbon footprint a heck of a lot more than any housing near transit. So I think having workers who spend money, who can support these retail services that we take for granted in our city, near residential neighborhoods, but not in residential neighborhoods, I think is important. Because if we want the quality of life that we are used to, we want this quality of life that is enabled by, I think the word that Rosenblum used was system. We want an ecosystem that can support this kind of vibrancy in retail, where we walk around and get things without having to jump in our cars, which I think is actually important, especially since there is a larger and larger older population, which maybe can't drive all the time anymore. But I think that's also why I think there's one thing to say, well, what does a market want? And there's another thing to think about, well, what does it take to keep the quality of life in Palo Alto high? And that might mean smaller units, so that the generation that has helped build Palo Alto and kept it vibrant can stay in Palo Alto and walk to services. It also might mean smaller units, so that the people that pay all the sales tax and keep all these retail businesses alive, so that we could go there one day a week, can survive. And so I think that's something that we need to think about. And so anyways, I'll continue next time.
Commissioner King.
Thank you. I'm going to use my first round, at least primarily for questions. I'd like to ask, is it Joanna, our consultant? Yeah. Can you just explain your firm? And I assume you do I've done these for multiple cities, and maybe if you just give me an estimate of like how many towns or cities you've done EIRs in support of comp plans.
Sure. I've been with the Police Works, which is formerly the Planning Center DCNE, and formerly DCNE for 15 years as of this month. And for most of that time, I've been working on general plans, and the vast majority of general plans that I work on, I also manage the preparation of the EIR for that general plan. So I would say probably a dozen general plan EIRs over that time.
Of all different size?
Yeah.
Huh? Okay, great, thanks. And so, let's see, a question. So the way, I'm interested in the process of how we got here. So now we've got the 4 scenarios, but within each of those scenarios, there are maybe 4 to 8 different components. And so really, if you were to say, hey, we're going to do the math, there would be hundreds of different ways you could take those components and mix and match them. But what we've ended up with is 4 scenarios with specific components, a choice of each of those 4 to 8 components within those plans. Why is that, and how does that support the process?
It's a pretty typical process for a community to go through to do what Palo Alto has done and use public input to identify the parts of the city that are most likely to change during the horizon of the general plan, or in Palo Alto's place, the comp plan, like what we did at workshop number 2, and then refine in workshop number 3. So when we asked for that input from residents and we thought about it as staff, as the consultant team, we came up with these 6 areas that are the 6 kind of building blocks of the alternatives that are in your staff report, where it seemed like at least some people and some of the groups from the workshops felt comfortable saying that one or more of those areas could be a place that might change over the next 15 years. And that excludes, as you can see from the map that we showed, the vast majority of Palo Alto, the R1 areas, the open space areas. So when we narrow our focus to those 6 opportunity sites, as we're terming them in this process, then we can kind of just think about those as the building blocks for the individual 4 alternatives. When we do the analysis in the EIR, it's true that there's kind of almost an infinite way that the different alternatives could be combined or recombined within those areas, even if you limit it to those 6 areas. But what we're going to need is citywide scenarios that we can compare apples to apples for things like the traffic analysis, for example. It is really a incomprehensible level of complexity if we were to try to publish a document that looks at 6 alternatives in one area, and what would that be compared to 12 alternatives in a different area. So we're going to be using these building blocks to put together 4 citywide alternatives, and what we're trying to do is come up with alternatives that both explore different options for each one of the 6 areas across the 4 alternatives, but are also internally coherent, so that they make an alternative that makes sense if it was to be adopted as a whole. But just to be clear, there's no requirement that what's ultimately adopted has to be exactly one of the alternatives. It could be a mixing and matching of different facets of that were considered in the alternatives, or even something that wasn't necessarily considered.
Okay, so it's really to reduce complexity that would be just unmanageable, you have to do this. And with the other EIRs you've done in support of other general plans, comp plans, is that the same on each? So you come up with 4 alternatives, or is that specific to Palo Alto?
What's very unique to Palo Alto is that the EIR will cover all of those alternatives at the same level of detail. Many cities do a very similar process, as I've said, but the analysis of the alternatives might come before the EIR, and the city would go through the process that you're going through now to identify which alternative it thinks it wants to commit to, and then only study that one at a great level of detail in the EIR. So Palo Alto is kind of leaving those options open much longer and getting a greater level of analysis about each one of the alternatives, because the EIR level of analysis that we would do if a city had already selected an alternative is much greater than the level of analysis that we would do earlier in the process for them, while they're kind of still exploring the alternatives and thinking about which one they like the best, or which one they want to create as their preferred land use plan.
So this is sort of the deluxe process where we're saying, hey, we want to invest. Okay, great.
I'm sorry, could I just add one comment? I want to amplify a little bit on that. 2 ways. One is the reason we chose to go, and the City Council supported this idea of analyzing alternatives at an equal level of detail, is it allows us to have a process where we're getting the kind of input we've received here this evening longer into the process. So well after the draft plan and draft EIR on the street, we're still going to be talking about trade-offs and options between the alternatives. Typically, you'd start to narrow that discussion and that engagement process much sooner in the process. So that was the motivation for the process we've developed. The other thing I wanted to mention is we're a little bit, I don't know how to say this exactly, but we're using our crystal ball to try and come up with alternatives that bracket a range of possible outcomes for the city and the planning process. And to a large extent, we're counting on the wisdom of the commission, the public, and the council to help us structure that range well, so that the plan that is ultimately considered for adoption falls within that range. But I just wanted to make sure everyone understood it's not a guarantee. We might get to the end of the process, and if we've guessed wrong and we want to do something outside the range, then our EIR is going to be lacking. So we have to do a good job at selecting this range of alternatives to bracket the possible impacts so that we give ourselves a maximum possibility, at the end of the day, to proceed expeditiously to a decision. I hope that's clear. It's a little bit of a...
Yeah, no, I think that it's basically the largest envelope possible, so understood. Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Gardias.
Thank you, Chair. So before I get to the essence, I just want to give a couple of kudos to the audience and a couple of good comments, because I thought about the same. So, Mr. Nielsen Buchanan, thank you very much about your comments about dynamic plan, right? Of course, it's an important comment. But also data division that you recommended to Mrs. Gittelman. I think that if you tie it to the conversation about the business registry, have we had an analyst with Hadoop queries, pretty much we would not need to have a business registry, because a person like that probably would answer that question with just running the queries, out of the big data. So that's one point. The second point, that the second comment I heard from Mr. Steve Rizzelblum about undergrounding Caltrain, which is exactly the same scenario that New York had many years ago when they were pretty much redesigning Grand Central Station. They were doing this because of the different objectives. They just wanted to, the issue was to address the steam locomotives, and that was their problem. But because they were able to, by re-engineering this, they were able just to create this massive value out of for the real estate above the train tracks in the middle of Manhattan, and they created this way Park Avenue, right? It would create automatically probably $1 billion or maybe more for Palo Alto if we did this, not just eyeballing this, and for the other adjacent municipalities. So thank you very much for those comments. Please come here more often. So I want to just, yes. So I want to address a couple of specific aspects on the from these concepts that we have. So a couple of commissioners talk about the concept number 4. So it looks like an overlay to me, as opposed to a concept itself. It has a mixture of the prescriptive designations and then some policy aspects. And because of this, it's not as clear as you would like, so it may be confusing for the audience and then may not be clean cut. So I would recommend just to remove it, and as others spoke in the same spirit, create an overlay on all the other concepts, and then drop some aspects that are prescriptive in this. So just focus on the net zero energy as opposed to planning aspects, right? So that's about concept number 4. From perspective of concept number 3, I would like to, we had from the couple of speakers that they were against 55 feet raising, they were against raising 55 limit to the 55 feet, and some other growth elements. What I would like to just supporting this that notion, I would like to just focus on this concept because it addresses development or redevelopment around the transit nodes, and that's very important. Other two concepts, they don't have it. So maybe by removing this 55 feet limit or increase of the limit to the 55 feet height, but then as opposed to this, focusing on some other areas that are underdeveloped. And then when I met with Stephen, we talked about allowing or discussing development of the parking lots that is not within the downtown cap. That could be opportunity for the downtown as well as the California Avenue without raising any limit. Okay, thank you very much.
Vice Chair Keller.
Thank you. So firstly, I hope that we prominently indicate where people can subsequently, in between the meetings, email their comments in, and I assume they go to this Palo Alto Comp Plan or our Palo Alto website, and there are places to email your comments. So please keep those cards and letters coming in, folks. The next thing is with respect to a living comp plan. One of the things I noticed in the chart, it wasn't necessarily it wasn't a more out Palo Alto process in an earlier meeting, not tonight's meeting, was the idea that after the comp plan is created, there will be some interactive web-based thing. And I think that the idea of creating a highly hyperlinked, highly searchable, highly indexed, highly integrated comp plan that allows you to explore and analyze and find the ones that are relevant. I think that's possible for Palo Alto to do that, and I think if we do an excellent job, we may even win an award for making a comp plan actually accessible to the community, and I would look forward to that. So let me get into the detailed comments. First of all, I would consider myself a data scientist, and that what I know about being a data scientist is this concept of garbage in, garbage out. If the input to your data is garbage, the output will be garbage. So the interesting thing is we need to make sure we have hard data. I've spent several days in the last few weeks analyzing census data based on transportation and such, and had a number of conversations with Hillary and with Roland Rivera about this, and I was hoping we'd have some data about that. I'll work on that and produce some of that. But essentially, one of the things from that analysis is, yes, when you add more housing near transit, you get slightly more transit use. But you get a lot more cars, too. In fact, a lot more cars than you get a slight increase in transit use. And the idea of transit-oriented housing makes sense in the East Bay, where people are in bedroom communities commuting to San Francisco. It's not the kind of commute patterns we have in Palo Alto. Somewhere on the order of approximately 60%, maybe a little less than 6%, of people who live in Palo Alto, work and are employed, work in Palo Alto, Stanford, Menlo Park, or Mountain View. Okay, so they're going to drive or bike or walk, and therefore what you really want to do is increase walkability and increase bikeability. And in fact, biking has increased dramatically over the last 10, 12 years, more than anything else, and that's pretty impressive. Okay, a couple things. First of all, we need to think about the school impacts of growth. The comprehensive plan is the only time when we look at development or redevelopment, as Commissioner Olchak, I guess he would know the term, is the idea is this is the only time we can look at school impacts. We must look at them now, or we will not look at them at all. And I think we should also think about a financial analysis on the city budget, because now's the time to look at that, and it's not typically part of an EIR process, but should be added to it. So alluding to my question is we really need to understand for Palo Alto, not for the East Bay, how much does housing near transit drive transit use versus driving, if you will. We need to think about expanding retail. People want to have more opportunities for retail, pushing retail, making more services. When we think about services, probably the number one service people think about besides schools is retail. Retail use is being able to walk to that. And there are other things like libraries and things like that. But we probably use retail more than we use any other service besides schools. I mentioned the idea of promoting bicycling and walking to work. We should rename the no project alternative. It's not do nothing. It is really business as usual. It is really growing to the maximum allowed by zoning based on market pressures. That's what it really is. Okay? Call it what it is. In terms of alternative 3, we should focus on transit-oriented jobs, which appropriately they are slow growth, and service-oriented housing. And just think of transit as another service. It shouldn't be elevated among everything else. Really think about housing near services. And I think Stephen Levy is exactly right. It's in terms of all those other trips people take, not just the commute trips that are important. In terms of alternative 4, we have we should think in terms of no new net trips. And then, can I finish alternative 4? So in terms of no new net trips with offsets. In other words, if you put more cars on the road, get somebody else's cars off the road by paying for shuttles, by particularly for our school kids. Think about the more of our school kids that you get off the roads and parents driving into the school. That's a significant improvement. No new net zero greenhouse gases. Now, in particular, I'm not talking about no net vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle miles traveled is considered as part of greenhouse gases. Okay? No new net trips affects Palo Alto and affects the traffic within Palo Alto. No, net zero water, and no net overflow parking into the neighborhoods. To me, that's the real issue of net zero, and I'll continue my comments later.
So when I was introduced to the current comp plan, which was adopted in 1998, on the very first section, it says that there is no single vision for the city, yet each element has a beginning portion which is entitled vision. To me, the lack of the single overarching vision is a fatal flaw. And I think it is carried out in terms of leadership of the city and the council, the mayor, whatever, who can't speak to what the vision is. So there's this sense of it's open for debate, or maybe there's seeds of mistrust. And I think it's critical that the comp plan that we adopt from now to 2030 state a clear vision and not miss that opportunity. And I think part of leadership comes from listening to the public, but it also may involve leading. I think that the role of the chair of the Planning Commission, which I've been privileged to do for half a year now and will do for a while longer, is in some sense to ensure that we have an effective deliberative body and not to show my sort of personal opinions whenever the chance arises. But I think I'm going to put on my resident hat a little bit and just say that, like some of the speakers in the public, I was born here, 1951. I grew up here, attended Palo Alto Public Schools, and then Stanford. I've been very fortunate. I could live anywhere, and I sincerely believe that this is a great place to call home. In that sense, I may be a residentialist, but I sincerely disagree with the implications from the militant anti-growth rhetoric that faction of the voters is discussing as it relates to the comp plan. On a personal level, in the foreseeable future, my wife and I have this lovely home in the community center neighborhood. It's a very large house. It's now an empty nest. We may be looking to follow in the steps of Stephen Levy and find a nice apartment somewhere. And I think that the fact that the comp plan is bowing to the concerns of the community and not touching the R1 allocation in our zonable living space is a mistake. Because when the time comes, I don't think there's any inventory for me and my wife to find the kind of place that we'd like to call home. Much as we'd like to stay in Palo Alto, that inventory doesn't exist. So in no particular sense of priority, one of the concerns that comes up throughout the document, different alternatives, is preservation of historic character of the city. And when I first saw the housing element, policy number 1 of the housing element is preserve the character of existing neighborhoods. And I went somewhat berserk because I'd spent decades in large public companies trying to make decisions based on data. And I think, well, character, how do you measure it? Where's the data? Then I realized I became a history major at Stanford when I took the course on American character. I thought, okay, all right, so I can get my teeth into this. But I think one of the aspects of preservation of historic character is we should allow for the creation of resources the future will view as historic. because I think that that is one of the things that we should do in our planning, the legacy of Palo Alto. Growth is an unfortunate metaphor to me. I agree with colleagues who note that this is a built-out city. Any development is infill development or even redevelopment. I think it's not, although growth is what everyone uses as the catchphrase, I think it's change. It's not growth, it's change. And I think if you think of it as change versus no change, to me, no change is a recipe for entropy, disaster, decline, not anything that any one of us would appreciate. You know, if we have yards, we plant flowers. You know, we grow trees. We promote positive change, and I think change is good if properly managed, but it's always threatening because it's change. And density and height, I think that there's many virtues in a community to critical mass relative to vibrancy, walkability, utilization of infrastructure, distribution of city services, and so forth. And I think in many ways, cities that allow for selectively more height, greater density, can take advantage of those virtues and leverage those resources which benefit many of us profoundly. My personal opinion, although I'm perfectly willing to follow the law, is that relaxing the 50-foot height limit selectively would allow an additional story, going from 4 stories to 5 stories in certain neighborhoods where that may be appropriate, downtown, perhaps California Avenue, perhaps along El Camino. And can I have more time? Yes, I can. So I think that the sacrosanct nature of the height limit is a mistake, personally. But if it's the law, I will follow the law. But I won't necessarily think it's a good policy. With Stephen Levy and Greg Tanaka, I served on the Infrastructure Blue Ribbon Commission, and I think that in the comp plan alternatives, it's critical that we address the top priorities of infrastructure needs. I think the Caltrain plan, whether it's the trench, undergrounding, the longer we wait, the more it's going to cost, and the longer until we have the benefit of that incredibly sensible idea. What to do with the Municipal Services Center, which was, by the way, the biggest single ticket item on the list of the $500 million in infrastructure items that are unfunded given to IBRIC to study. The MSC is going to be underwater, not too many decades hence, and that's going to be a bad thing. So where do you put it? It's got emergency response resources, and if there's a catastrophic earthquake and the overpasses get threatened, how do the emergency vehicles get to put out the fires and save you? Another thing is the location of city services and above ground infrastructure is clustered on the north end of town, which I think is unfair in many ways to the residents who don't live in the north end of town. And perhaps City Hall, the public safety building, should be relocated to the geographic center of the city, which is close to California Avenue, and maybe allow for incredible opportunity for this block to be used in a different way. Many colleagues have noted that Palo Alto likes to think of itself as special, sometimes does planning in isolation, but we're actually part of a region. And figuring out more robust processes for regional collaboration with East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Stanford, Mountain View, and so on, Los Altos, is incredibly important, such that we have a comprehensive plan that dovetails with the comprehensive plans of the adjacent communities and the regional plans. And then finally, Palo Alto likes to think of itself as a city. I did a little research. I was a lawyer once, and I did the legal research. It makes no difference under the law if you call yourself a city or a town. It doesn't matter. But if you call yourself a city, and we're the 113th largest city in the last census, we're not very big. We're not very important, except in our own minds. I think if you think of yourself as a city, that leads you to making decisions that are appropriate to cities. If you think of yourself as a town or a village, then maybe you go in a different direction. So I think that self-image confusion would be important to sort of work out in this version of the comprehensive plan, because if we want to grow up as a major city, then you make different decisions. If we're perfectly content being a small, livable town, that's different, and that's okay. I mean, as I said, I grew up here, I like it here. I wouldn't have lived anywhere else, but maybe someday I'll have to. So I'll stop for now. Round two, in maybe a different order from round one. Anybody primed and ready to go? Vice Chair Keller is ready.
Thank you. So a couple of things. First of all, there is unlimited demand for housing and offices in Palo Alto. And it's certainly true that if you build it, they will come. And if you allow them to build it, they will. And that may not be true in the same degree in other communities. And we cannot quench the demand for people to live in Palo Alto. And if we did allow everybody to live in Palo Alto, our schools would be so overcrowded that their quality would be destroyed. So that's what we face, is basically people move here for the schools, often. And people want to stay in our community. And therefore, it's not a matter of the idea that the market wants. It's not the market who wants big units to be built in townhouses. It's the people who build the big units that want to put them in townhouses. They want it because it's the most profitable. But it's not our objective to make things as nice for the redevelopers so that they can maximize their profits. What we instead want to do is zone for what we want, which is a saying that I've heard one of the council members use a lot. Zone for what we want. And in particular, the issue is that in order for Chair Michael to stay in the community, we need to build the kind of housing we want to build is housing he can downsize to, which is smaller units. Senior housing, studios and one-bedrooms are the kind of housing that's missing and will provide the kind of diversity that we think we want in that we say we want in Palo Alto. We think in terms of height, 50 feet, 55 feet. I think we need to think in terms of how many stories that is also. So the reason that the suggestion was to go to 55 feet is because people think of 50 feet as being 4 stories. But now the discussion is that they want a few extra feet more for the first story in order to have a higher height retail, because that's what retail wants. So is 55 feet 4 stories? Is 60 feet 5 stories? Well, if you go to 5 stories, then you have this short retail. So I think that the idea is to go to 55 feet, but mean 4 stories, not 5. And so you have to think in terms of the number of stories, because that also affects the amount of square footage. Even if we don't build another square foot of office space, there will still be an increase in jobs in Palo Alto due to an intensification of jobs density. They're hoteling. They're pushing people smaller and smaller spaces. We saw that what happened with Facebook when it's adjacent to College Terrace. They crammed them in cheek to jowl, and that's the trend more so than, we have some law offices where people get lots of space, but we also have startups in which people are crammed in cheek to jowl. So let me make a couple of detailed comments on this. Firstly, in order to think about slowing the jobs growth, what we really want to think about is allowing retail expansion, considering a mix of retail, and if you're going to slow the growth of office space, of non-residential, non-retail space, then you want to think about how to do it. A cap doesn't work because when you exceed the cap, people say, you exceed the cap, you're not allowing me to develop what I have the right to develop because of my zoning rights. I have the right to develop to my FAR and whatever. Well, and so therefore, instead, what you need to think about is in terms of an air rights allocation. If you say you're allowed to grow so many square footage more, then allocate it out. And make sure you leave room for TDRs. You allocate it out. If somebody wants to build, they got to buy it from somewhere. Other cities do that. They limit the amount of growth by allocating air rights. In terms of limiting the residential growth, you can do that by, I believe, by limiting market rate housing to the RENA allocation for above moderate. You're not limiting below market rate housing. If the below market rate housing developers can can buy the land and develop the housing, they can do it without having a cap. That's the way you can. I think that that's a legal process for accomplishing the limit of residential growth. I think that it is very important to limit Caltrain. Underground Caltrain. Now, I was an advocate back in 2008, before the election. The Palo Alto Weekly had a stint about undergrounding Caltrain high-speed rail, and I was the advocate for cut and cover. And there's a zippering approach where you can sort of alternate which side you cover and do things like that in order to be able to cover most of it and yet allow for the escape so that it's not too expensive in terms of if there's a crash or something like that. To the extent that we, working with SVLG in getting money to BART, which is going to happen, and we get money for Caltrain and make sure that some of that money goes for grade separations for Caltrain. There'll be money for grade separations for the 4 grade separations in Palo Alto. If with that money, we could either have overpasses built, basically train going over, or we could figure out how to spend the additional money through a bond issue that I think would be partly paid for by developing over that land to put the train underneath. And you can do that both south of Oregon Expressway, but I think we should also collaborate with Menlo Park to underground north of Oregon Expressway. Now, you can't underground where Oregon Expressway is because changing that interchange is just too expensive. But north of Oregon Expressway into Menlo Park, working with Menlo Park to underground until it gets to Atherton, maybe Atherton wants to pay for undergrounding further, that's a possibility. And with a cut and cover approach, with the tracks, with the roads slightly raised over the tracks, you don't have to cut it under, and you sort of essentially tunnel slightly under San Francisco Creek, under the El Palo Alto, which you can do because redwood roots go laterally out. Okay. In terms of El Camino height limit increase, we have to be careful about not next to R1 residential, particularly in Barron Park. There are places where the lots are deeper. There are places where the lots are shallower. There are places where the shallow lots are separated from R1 housing by a narrow alleyway. You don't want a 50-foot or higher canyon to be happening, overtowering the R1 properties that are often 1 story and sometimes 2 on the other side. So you have to think about where you need to do that, and that's why we need to have an El Camino Real, particularly South El Camino Real, concept area plan, so we can study where it makes sense for higher, where it makes sense for non-higher, and where it makes sense to, in fact, lower the heights, because you want to do it context-based, you want to do it concept-based, and based on context. not other things. So let me mention the comment that was made about distribution of services around the city by neighborhood. I agree with that as a thing that we need to evaluate. In terms of flooding and sea level rise, I think that's an important consideration, particularly for the regional water quality control plant. I won't even use the expression I would use in terms of what happens if that's underwater. I think we need a Fry's area precise plan in order to understand that big piece of land redevelopment is comparable to what happened when we redeveloped the Palo Alto Medical Foundation when it moved. If SOFA deserved a precise plan, which it has, in fact there are 2 of them for SOFA 1 and SOFA 2, we need one for Fry's. I'll close by asking this question. Of staff, I guess, when will we choose an alternative among these 4? How does that process happen for choosing an alternative among these 4, including the mix and match along them? Because I presume that we may not pick one alternative or another alternative. We may pick a mix and match. So maybe you can sort of give an answer to that.
Sure, let me start, and then Joanna and Stephen can add on if necessary. But I think our concept is that we'll continue to get input on these, on 3 or 4 concepts, try and get direction from the council at some point to move them forward into the EIR analysis, carry them through to the draft EIR stage, and the draft EIR will tell us what their relative merits and impacts are. So we'll understand their benefits and impacts at a greater level of detail when the draft EIR is available. And after the comment period on the draft EIR, that's when we would try and narrow it down to what our preferred alternative is. And we could choose one of the alternatives. If we guessed right, and one of the alternatives in the range we've described is it, we love it, we'll go with that. If we want to massage them and choose one alternative with modifications or elements from another alternative, as long as we've captured the impacts of that blend in the range of alternatives, we should be okay to proceed to the final EIR and plan adoption. So that's the strategy for now. So if we stay on schedule, we're talking about first quarter of 2015, we'd be making the decision how to get down from 4 alternatives to 1.
Commissioner Alchek?
Timing this session. You want me to time it?
Okay, so I just want a few specifics. I think in the focus development alternative, I share the view that I think Commissioner Michaels suggested, which is that in those selected sites, I think the approach should consider a meaningful deviation from the height limit. And I know we've articulated this notion of sort of a greater height on ground floor retail. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not just suggesting 55 or 65 or. I guess that part is open. I'm not suggesting a specific height increase. Just that increase could be exceeded potentially. I'd also like to state that this is a unique moment. I share Bob Moss's opinion regarding dictating market preferences, dictating preferences to the market. I don't believe this body, or the City Council for that matter, has the expertise to dictate what size units should be developed in Palo Alto. I believe the marketplace and the market players should have freedom and flexibility there, especially because I like to throw this out there. I was at Planning Commissioner Academy this year, and the keynote speaker talked about the future of transportation, specifically personal vehicles. And he showed a picture of Fifth Avenue in 19 whatever, someone I can't recall, 20s, 30s, and then he showed a picture of it 10 years later, and the picture basically represented there was a single horse and carriage on Fifth Avenue, and then 10 years later there were probably 30 or 40 cars. And he suggested that in that 10-year span, this was just an unbelievable change in the way we transported ourselves. And then he suggested that, do you think that the change from potentially cars we have to drive to cars that are self-driven will take that long? And how would that look if we depicted it in a picture? And I only mention that because he suggested, and potentially very accurately, what would we do with all our parking garages if suddenly the cars that took us everywhere didn't have to be parked, because after we used them, they picked up another person and kept on running indefinitely. And so I was astonished after he made that comment, because all I kept picturing were 4 or 5 story parking garages that were suddenly empty, and what would we do with all our garages? Obviously that change is not going to be overnight, but I mention it because the market reacts much more quickly to the needs, its own needs, than I think boards and commissions and councils can really determine. And so I think part of our Palo Alto process will always be flawed to some extent because technology is changing at a very fast pace, and there will be some potentially magnificent impacts, specifically in the transportation in the transportation category over the next 15 years. We're all talking about what it was like 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we're all making the assumption that in 15 years, traffic's going to be 10 times worse. What if this keynote speaker, he was a Stanford professor in the business school and a transportation expert, what if his predictions come true and suddenly we're all in self-automated cabs that we own have some ownership percentage share? I have no idea. But anyway, in a similar vein, when it comes to the discussion of rail and transportation infrastructure, I'm reminded of a lecture I attended by Tom Friedman at De Anza, and his quote was something like, if you visited Grand Central Station in New York, or Grand Central in New York, and then you went to the Central Station in Berlin, you would think they won the war. Something to the effect of how we've really avoided investing any money in our mass transit infrastructure. I continue to think that this high-speed rail discussion has a place in our comprehensive plan and in its alternatives. And I know that there are significant expenses to some of the ideas that some people have mentioned, and maybe even significant opportunities if you think about it. But it's a huge asset to this community, and so the potential changes that may come from the state's investment in high-speed rail, I don't know how we incorporate that, but that will magnify the value of transit-oriented development, I think. I think if the rail was faster, maybe it would be even more appealing. Or I'm not exactly sure how to put that into words, but I just think there's some real innovative opportunities for discussion, and I think it can be incorporated into the notion of how we plan for transit-oriented development. Okay.
Commissioner King, I see you have some notes there.
Thanks. Let's see. I've got some questions still, but I guess in keeping with the theme that we want to do our big picture position statements. So regarding Palo Alto as a system and somehow that resulting in a compelling need for growth, I think that every physical system has a maximum capacity. And in our case, our city has a fixed geography, and that means there's a fixed amount of how many humans and how much built stuff can exist within our city. So to act as if growth is perpetual and inevitable is not logical. Just as if you own a home on a lot, you can't keep growing indefinitely. At some point, you've got enough stuff there. So I'm not saying we're there, but I'm saying that growth is a choice. That's a stolen quote. And that it's a function of what's here now. It's a function of the infrastructure we have, how much infrastructure we can put in, and the type of zoning that we have built now. And that ultimately, it's the residents should decide when is there enough growth. Again, it cannot go on infinitely. And regarding the Palo Alto as a town versus a city, I call Palo Alto a town. It may be changing, but I believe it to be a town. If you look at the great cities, the great transport cities, they've got zoning of 20 to 50 units per acre. And so that enables, say, Manhattan to have transit that's within a 5 to 10 minute walk of just about everybody. And so in that case, density works great, and it draws the services. So all residents are, I think Commissioner Keller's quote was service oriented, basically. The issue we have here in Palo, and that's true also of smaller towns along historical rail districts, along Caltrain. If you look at the core downtowns along Caltrain before the post-war boom, if you look at Marin, Larkspur, Sausalito, Fairfax, all those places have density of probably 20 to 40 units per acre. The challenge we have in Palo Alto is the bulk of the town is on 6,000 square foot lots, so that's like 5 units per acre. And so if you, as we densify that the downtown, that means that, and therefore there will always be, with any density, there's not 100% usage of transit. That means that the impacts to those people who live on 6,000 square foot lots and are not within a quarter-mile walking distance to services and transport becomes a significant burden. And so I think we have to be very careful in assuming that the density, continued density downtown or in the identified areas is manageable without horrendous impacts to those people who can't change their zoning. They're on one of those 6,000 square foot lots. I'd also say regarding the transit versus car, cars are, I think I actually looked at the numbers. Cars are actually getting quite efficient. If you put 4 people in a Prius, it's about as fuel efficient, carbon efficient as riding the train. There's an assumption amongst many people that trains and buses they're there, so there must be no carbon usage. But in fact, trains particularly are big, huge things that need to be moved up and down tracks that burn a lot of fuel. So in my mind, the move to non-car transport is probably more for congestion issues than it is for our carbon footprint. And so my point is that where we have non-transit-oriented development here in Palo Alto, the car is probably going to be the solution, and hopefully we can improve its efficiency. Regarding the climate change and the densification of zoning here, saving the planet or materially altering climate change, I'm very hopeful that could be the case. I'd like to see that scientifically supported. It may actually make more sense to have 7 Fresnos built with 20 to 50 units per acre for saving the planet than it does us trying to make 20 to 50 units per acre in our town, and therefore potentially causing more and more gridlock. And the other, okay, that's my statement, the statements. Then I'd like to go back for the comments. So I would like to make sure that we are considering the future of retail. I mean, if you look around, you see how many competitors, Google, I think eBay, all these competitors that are about delivering the services to us rather than us going and purchasing the services. So I am curious as to how we factor that into a plan during which time we can expect significant changes in how we purchase and obtain goods. And one last one. Can you tell me regarding the online input for the comp plan, is that anonymous?
Users have to register to use the system. If you want to provide a comment or respond to a comment, you have to register with your name and address. You don't have to have an address here in Palo Alto. Anyone can register. It's just a process of verifying that there's an actual person and not, a robot behind the input that is being received. But once the person registers, they have the option of displaying their name or not displaying their name.
And so why would we think that that's appropriate that residents of any town can have equal input on our comp plan? Sure.
There's not a restriction on registering, and people from Palo Alto could register and go give comments on another person's site as well if they wanted to. But what there are online are a number of tools. If you go to the online forum and look, there are tools where you can map the location of any not the specific location, but you can map the responses from inside versus outside Palo Alto, and that's another reason for collecting that address information.
That's based on but that's they're not verified by anybody.
It's just an automated verification system that this is a legitimate address, but there's not a background check to make sure that one person lives at that exact address.
Okay, well, that's of some concern to me because it means there's, we don't know really who's commenting on our comp plan. Thank you.
Commissioner Tanaka.
Okay, well, lots of good comments. So I have a suggestion that might help. So I've been looking at the different concepts, concept 1, 2, 3, 4, and these concepts are all very kind of like zoning code based, right? Which is not surprising. But I was thinking that rather than making zoning code based, maybe what we should do is make it more results based. Like, what do we want out of it? So, for instance, I guess what I'm trying to say is make it more mission based. So maybe concept one, although Vice Chair Keller cynically called it I forgot what he called it, but it's business as usual. Business as usual one, okay. Concept 2 maybe is, or I guess concept 2, 3, 4, they're all very similar, but basically no growth whatsoever or something to that effect. And then maybe there could be a third concept or fifth concept, but maybe, and it's kind of a concept I'm going to call like trying to maximize not for no development or de facto, but maybe trying to optimize it for quality of life. I know that's extremely subjective and depends on who you're talking to, but I think we've heard various comments on the commission and from the attendees tonight, but what do we do to maximize the quality of life? And rather than thinking about it in terms of zoning, right, in terms of like zero development as it is, but what about how do we maximize quality of life? And so I think that's a hard one because it's so very subjective. But I've listed a few thoughts, and these will probably be controversial. So I'd love to get feedback and thoughts on it. But so one of them, I do think that the preservation R1 is important. Although I do sympathize the fact that we need housing for seniors as well as the workers, young single workers in the city. But I think that's actually kind of an important tenet for the city. I think also it's important to, and I think Vice Chair Keller said it very well earlier, which is aside from schools, the service that people use most are these retail establishments. I do agree that the nature of retail is changing dramatically, and I think about that a lot, all the time. But I mean, what makes, I think, Palo so great is exciting University Avenue. It's Cal Ave. It's being able to go somewhere close without having to jump on a train or car and go up to San Francisco, right? I think that's actually very important. So how do we make this robust, awesome retail experience that's second to none, that makes this place lively, makes a place that we want to live, not just a place where we want to retire. And so those are kind of like the first two thoughts I've been thinking about in terms of how do we get an awesome quality of life. I do think preservation of really high quality schools is also important because that's a service. So I guess how do you maximize kind of top level things? How do we maximize the highest level of service for everyone? And then the thing about it is how do you sustain these services? And I think, so there's a couple of thoughts here. So one thought is, I think the tax base in Palo Alto is actually very important. So, the chair and I both served on IBRC, and we know the state of our infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure funds, and the fact that even though we're a very wealthy city as individuals, the city itself is not wealthy. I mean, compared to a lot of neighboring cities, it's not wealthy at all. So how do we enable this robust sales tax base or tax base so that allows us to do all the things that we want to do and have it the vibrant city that we all want to live in? And so, so I think thinking about how do we financially make the city strong and robust, so we could do the cool things like I don't think there's anyone in this room who thinks that Caltrain should be above ground. I don't think there's anyone here that thinks that. But the problem is that nobody has really good answers. How are you going to finance that? I mean, could you finance it by selling the space to make office space, perhaps, or could you sell the space to, how do you turn a wish into a reality? And so, if we have the finances, if we are able to monetize the land, if we're able to make these dreams come true rather than just talk about it, I think that's important. So, and because it's one thing to wish it or to say, oh, this is a preference, it's another thing to actually make it happen. And I think making a super high quality of life city is something we should make happen. Okay, anyways, I'd love to get feedback from others on this quality of life concept.
Commissioner Rosenblum?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I use my first session. Is it on? Oh, there we go. Use my first session for some large bore, hopefully not boring, but more high level concepts, and then moving into specific input for the consultants. And again, I think this is a really good job, and I think it's easier to engage with these concepts. And I agree with Mr. Levy that it has to get more specific for it to really have teeth, and so my comments are really about this now. Ideally, people really are going to react to impact on traffic, parking, and then finally schools. The schools bit may be outside your scope, but I want to come back to that in a second. And so what I'd love to be able to see is the actual model that you use. So the EIR makes mention of the transportation demand model. I'd like to know the inputs and outputs. So what inputs and what assumptions do you use? So Vice Chair Keller brought up an excellent point. I'm glad he's doing the data research. I'd love to see this, that you put a building next to transit, that you increase transit use slightly, but you increase car use dramatically. I think that that's a difficult data point to digest, because that means, what if I put a building there with no other policies? What if I, as we do, make sure you have adequate parking for all residents? Or what if you made sure that all residents had to have Caltrain Go Pass? Would that change the dynamics? Would the input change if it was optimized for younger people who tend to not have cars, or people that have families that tend to all have cars and have to use their cars? I think all these things change, and so I agree, garbage in, garbage out. It's a great piece of data, but I'd like to see if innovative policies change the assumptions. And in particular, I'd like to see the consultants' models and how they handle these assumptions, because I think it's very subtle. The policies that you have will influence the variables that you use. I'd like to know how we understand those variables. Even more specific, again, we talked about the 55-foot height limit. I completely agree, again, with Vice Chair Keller that probably the 55 came up because people said, oh, you need more height in retail. Ground floor, it's probably 4 stories. So it's inconsistent with the comment that the additional height should be used for residential. If that is the case, then it has to be even higher. If it's not the case, then you're talking about a 3-story building with additional height for residential. And even then, I'm not sure it actually makes sense. So that one, I think, go back and see what the actual logic was. I would say in the right area, I would support a higher height limit. Again, taking Bob Moss's comment to heart, much closer to transit. But again, taking Arthur's comments to heart, let's find out what happens under different circumstances and policies to encourage transit use. Next, again, 27 University, I'd like it to be in basically all of them except the business as usual, where by definition it's not considered. But it's such a large and important and strategically located parcel, it has to be considered. We need a concept that contemplates commercial growth outside of concept number 4. Concept number 4 I view as a pilot program to see if we can get to 0 net trips or energy used, or some concept of 0 net. That's the only way that has any commercial growth whatsoever. I think it's a mistake to have no policy specific that would have an increase in commercial cap. As unpalatable as that may be to some people, I think it's, if you're creating a solution set that goes from one end to the other and we're trying to see all the impacts, we're explicitly not using one of the axes, which is increased commercial space. Caltrain, I had mentioned, we have Caltrain being discussed only in option number 3. It probably needs to be, again, in all the options except for number 1. And also, you had mentioned it's from San Antonio to Page Mill. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. In fact, if anything, it's from Page Mill through downtown. And again, I admire by Chair Keller's knowledge of the root systems of redwoods. I think that it'd be great if we could have.
Palo Altos are different.
Oh, are they really?
Yes.
Oh God, I'm glad you brought that up. I was amazed.
They were searching for water.
Oh, is that so? We should feed it on the sides.
Has eroded.
Okay, well.
Yeah, so they're all twined around those bulkheads that hold up the bridge.
So Commissioner Rosenblum has the floor here. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I invited it. It's my fault. And so finally, when we do this model as I've asked for, so I've given some specific inputs on some of the things I think need to get adjusted in the scenarios. We need to rigorously annotate the assumptions. So, for example, the woman from the Audubon Society had made a statement saying there have been a lot of net zero proposals, none of them work. I think that that's demonstrably untrue. There are net zero proposals. Stanford is in our backyard and has had a net zero trips operation for 10 years. I worked at Google for a while. Number of Googlers on campus has increased dramatically. The number of cars has also increased at a much lower rate, though, through active management of these programs. So with innovative programs, there are things that can be done. There are programs that have worked in many areas of the country. But her point is generally correct, which is there's a lot of flim-flam. And so when we have the assumptions, it would be good to document why do we believe this is so, who else has done it, why do we believe it would work in our case, is our case like their case. And so the final thing to come back to the things that I think are the big tests, the two straw men that are always brought up, growth will lead to more traffic. So anything around traffic, just rigorous annotations, and I want to see where the assumptions come from. And two, growth puts unsupportable pressure on our schools. We're well below the peak population of Palo Alto schools. We're well above the nadir of Palo Alto schools. I'm not sure that there's a correlation necessarily between the degradation of schools versus the growth or decline. But again, to the extent that it can be thought of, this has to be done in conjunction with Palo Alto Unified School District. They've been very good at projecting their population. I'd be shocked if they are surprised by what's going on and that the overcrowding in schools is inevitable and destructive, but it has to be contemplated.
Commissioner Gardias.
Thank you very much, Chair. So a couple of points, and then a couple of other comments, but first two major points. So in terms of some discussions that we had here and about raising height, what I would like to see on all these plans, right, to giving prioritization of utilization of the existing opportunities. There is so much open space in Palo Alto that taking that space, and I'm talking parking lots, garages, unusual lots, right, before we start considering going over limit height, which should be in this sequence, right? Because otherwise, if we're going to start just going over the limits and increasing it, it's easy, of course, we can do it, right? But then we would be losing that opportunity, which from the planning perspective, it may be opportunity to build more of the retail space, walking area, and so forth, right? I'd like to just see it as a continuous walkable spaces, streets on the retail left side and right side, right, as opposed to of the higher buildings that have parking or garages between. That would be one of the priorities, and then I can give a couple of examples. For example, we talked in the past, is about moving cars underground, right? There are all this precious retail area that we have. It's taken by cars. In some buildings that have garages underneath, but they need the ramp, and ramp takes majority of the retail or the potential retail area in the ground space, or garages, right? That where retail space or some other space for public should be instead. Right, so that's a great opportunity. I would like to just make sure that we don't miss it, right? Or at least this should be a priority. Have this before some other heights. There is also another opportunity that I see here in the zoning. Zoning that we have in Palo Alto and zoning historically, right, is pretty much based on the historical on the historical separation of different land uses. That's not true today with the material and technology progress, right? And then also different laws. You can mix them and match them as you please, right? And in many areas, in many municipalities, mixed zoning it's standing up, and then zones are not for the land separation, but rather for regulation of the heights or some other factors. But then larger mixed usage is allowed, thus reducing a number of trips, greenhouse gases, commuting to the work, and so forth, right? And of course, greater utilization of the parking spaces as well, right? And then, so those are just two main points. A couple of other smaller items that when you prepare the studies, please just give us some numbers, right? We would like to see the consequences of all of these plans that we have. It would be for us easy to grasp what's the consequence of scenario 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Hopefully, we're gonna go away with 4, so 1, 2, and 3, right? Quantify them, just show us some numbers from the perspective of cost, additional population, and so forth. Thank you.
Vice Chair Keller.
I think I already went, but I'm going to just add three quick things. Okay, so the first thing is that it was mentioned that Palo Alto Unified School District, at its peak of 15,000 or so students, there are 24 elementary schools, 3 high schools, 3 middle schools. Now it's about over 12,000, which is somewhat over 50% where the trough was, if you will. There are only about a dozen elementary schools, 2 high schools. Each of these 2 high schools is at not quite double the original design capacity. And not only that, but if you look at the PAUSD projections, the ones that came out in December, which I read, it says they assumed no increase in housing. They can't project housing that doesn't exist. They only project specific housing units. So when the housing unit is built, they project for it. Before the housing unit is built, they don't project for it. So they actually have this drop-off, if you look at it, showing the rate of growth of the housing. And what happens is that housing, they basically have this nice drop-off that happens as the housing gets filled and students flow through the system, but they don't project out far enough in terms of additional housing. And in terms of smaller units, I just want to point out that the development that's replacing Equinox and We Fix Max is small units. And so there is demand for it in certain circumstances if we zone for it. Thank you.
Actually, before the public leaves tonight, I just wanted to make a very sad announcement that former Chair Eduardo Martinez, who preceded me as chair of the Planning Commission, served with distinction for 2 terms and was recently honored by the city for service, passed away last week. So he was he had a wonderful sense of compassion. He brought a sense of humor to discussions that were often contentious and controversial. I think many of us also were honored to be his friend, and he is he was a wonderful colleague. So he had a passion for good planning. Hopefully, the comprehensive plan will honor his passion, and it will reflect the collective wisdom of the community. He worked a lot on the land use element, proposed revision. I would just note that perhaps the land use element is the place where we should identify the need for any specific plans for downtown, or specific or precise plans, South El Camino, East Meadow Circle, Fabian Way, and East Embarcadero. Commenting on the alternative futures, I think this has almost been completely covered by my colleagues and by the public. I think that the alternative number 1, the do nothing or business as usual plan, it just left me with one big question, and that's the reference, the casual reference that the downtown development cap would be just exceeded. And I think that this is too important of a policy for that statement to be left hanging there. I think that we should understand exactly what the enforcement of this policy would be, or if it needs to be strengthened with an ordinance or a downtown specific plan. My personal bias is the alternative future one. Number one is not my favorite. Nor is the number two, the slow growth. And again, I'm not seeing many takers in my suggestion that we substitute the metaphor of change for growth, because I think I'm willing to work with the concept of growth, because obviously this is meaningful to most of us, if not all of us. But I don't think it's parsed in terms of what it actually means sufficiently. So does this mean population increase? Does it mean absolute number of employees as tabulated in a business registry and some ongoing metric of sorts? Does it mean non-residential square footage divided further into retail and office? Does it mean housing units? But I think that if growth at some level, slower, slowest, rapid, is the topic, we should be more precise. Option number three, which in my notes is slow development but focused housing and transit served areas. I think that the question that I've always had about transit and how it serves us is that it's almost it's dominated by intercity commuting transit, and it doesn't recognize any particular infrastructure associated with intracity movement. And I think that one of the changes in the way we live and work is that many of us don't commute intercity. This may be it's fortunate, but I think that, for example, most of us came here probably, other than Commissioner Alchek and a skateboard, we probably drove here because there is no intracity transit that is efficient. So I think if you're going to have focus on transit-served areas, I think that we ought to broaden what transit-served means, and I think it ought to include intracity transit. And the two things that disappointed me in number three, which was otherwise probably my preferred bucket, was the notion that the ideas in the California Avenue Area Concept Plan would be validated in terms of keeping California Avenue low scale. Again, putting off my impartial fiduciary role as chair of the commission, I would prefer to see California Avenue sort of more vibrant, a little bit higher scale, and I think that that would provide, some more mixed use, more opportunities for retail, more leveraging of transit, and perhaps even putting City Hall and the Public Safety Building there would be an improvement in the allocation of resources in the city. Likewise, for what came out of the workshops, I was disappointed that in this notion of walkability and sort of clustering things around sort of villages that are scattered around the city, places like Midtown and Charleston Plaza seem to be opportunities for bolstering, what's there that people could use, walk to, and maybe even allow for a little more density, more height. And I think I said pretty much everything else in the first round. And I'm going to yield to Commissioner Alchek.
There was one other comment I wanted to make about, and you just reminded me about it, and I've been thinking about it all week, which is I was sort of hoping that out of our Palo Alto meetings, there would be an opportunity to explore this notion of a limitation on chain stores, particularly in a California Avenue specific environment. I mention that because San Francisco has implemented chain store limitations in several areas of the city, and people often describe San Francisco as being a retail rainforest. If you look at Hayes Valley or the Mission, for example, you won't find stores that have more than 10 locations nationwide. And what that does is it changes the way a investor or a developer looks at a project. They're not building it for a Chipotle or a McDonald's or a Gap. They're building it for a potentially local business owner. What I'm hoping exploring that idea will do is it will encourage potentially an alternative that considers growth in, for example, the California Avenue area, mixed use growth, but it does so in a way that alleviates some of the concern that there won't be a place for our mom and pop businesses. So I just wanted to add, I'm not sure how to incorporate that in the alternatives we have. I also agree with my colleagues here that there should be an alternative that explores those growth options, potentially with certain policies in place that affect the growth in a way that is palatable. That's it.
Oh, so I had forgotten to make one comment, which doesn't respond directly to your alternatives, and that is, as one comes to study the comp plan, it takes a while to figure out where to find stuff. And what I heard from coming out of the workshops were a number of pretty articulate concerns that should be in the comp plan and should be easy to find. And I'm not sure where they go in terms of mapping them to the elements or to the alternatives that you've laid out, which may be useful for moving this forward. But the concerns that I noted from the workshops, and this was just in the materials that I think everybody had, quality of life in Palo Alto, livability, dealing with traffic congestion, enhancing transit, housing cost and affordability, growth management or change management, utilizing a relationship to Stanford and neighboring cities, some notion of what's the target jobs housing ratio, whether that's an imbalance or there's something ideal. Something about the Palo Alto process, the importance of trust with the public, transparency, governance, engagement, and so forth, I think is coming out of these workshops, is one of the elements in the comp plan. Dealing with the aging infrastructure from those of us who suffered or served on IBRIC. We had 300 meetings. Open space, what's the strategy relative to density or lack thereof, and then, transit demand management, transportation management associations, TDM, TMA, for you TLA fans. But I think that if there are key concerns, we had to figure out how to map them to what we publish. And so somebody who wants to focus on livability can find what's relevant to that. And maybe it's in the glossary, or maybe it's right up front, or maybe it's in the structure of some innovative way of presenting the comp plan. I'd like to thank everybody who showed up tonight, who listened and commented. Thank my colleagues, thank staff, consultants. I have more confidence after this evening's discussion in what will be the end result that I think I've had for the last several years. So hopefully that's shared. We're about to go into some housekeeping items, and maybe we'll just take a 5-minute break while people can relocate.
And Chair Michael, if I can just, for the benefit of everybody, talk about the next steps. We talked about it before. The August 4th City Council meeting is our next step. We're soliciting input on these concepts, these 4 concepts, between now and then. We'd love that input. We have to decide, based on your input this evening and the public's input this evening, whether we start making changes before this gets to council. My instinct is that, yes, we should. We should reflect all of this and continue to evolve and change these alternatives until the council sees them. It might create some confusion because we've asked people to comment on this version, but I think that's okay. We're at the part of the process where all of the input we get will be valuable in starting to winnow down the ideas and get to one final set of alternatives. So I thank you all for the input. We'll have to see what we can do to open up the hood and get a lot of the ideas you've articulated into one or more of these concepts as they move forward. But thank
Okay.
you.
So, quick break, and then we'll do some housekeeping. Can we get back to the meeting? Hey, Arthur?
Oh, it's a great one. Yeah, and the whole thing of the...
Stephen, can you bug Arthur?
Oh, we're good.
Yeah.
Toast and rice, the rice,
Yeah.
everything, yeah.
Greg? Yeah.
So that's on the system. Yeah. And just make sure there was what I meant by that is I think a lot of us have this notion that we love having
So we just have a few final matters to address. One is approval of minutes from June 11th, 2014, which commissioners received electronically. And do we have a motion to approve the minutes? Were there any? Was it as amended or?
I actually didn't get a chance to review them, so I'm going to abstain.
Okay. Motion from Commissioner Tanaka, seconded by Chair Michael. All in favor? Aye, with Vice Chair Keller abstaining.
I also abstain. I was not.
And Commissioner Rosenblum abstaining.
If I can give my comments tomorrow, I will, because it's too late. Okay.
And then we have commission staff announcements, updates, reports, and comments, if any. Hearing none, we can adjourn.
Great.